I took the job because it was quiet. That's what the man on the phone promised me. Quiet nights, easy money, just sit at the desk, keep the books balanced, and make sure the lights stayed on. It was only temporary, he said. A few weeks at most. The place had been closed for years, but the owners wanted someone there overnight while they sorted things out. The name of the place was the Briarwood Inn. I had never heard of it before, even though it sat only 20 miles from where I grew up. It rested at the edge of a narrow highway, half hidden behind tall, thin trees that leaned toward the road like they were listening for passing cars. When I pulled into the parking lot on my first night, my headlights washed over a faded wooden sign that still read Briarwood Inn in peeling gold letters. The building stood 3 stories tall, old brick darkened by time. Most of the windows were black, but the front entrance glowed softly. The electricity works, the man had said. He was right. Inside, the lobby lights hummed faintly. The air smelled like dust and something sweet underneath, like old perfume that had soaked into the walls years ago. The carpet was thick and patterned with tiny red flowers. My footsteps made almost no sound. The front desk computer was already on. That was the first thing that felt strange. I had expected to flip switches, to wake the place up myself, but the screen glowed blue, waiting for a password I'd been given earlier that day. The desk lamp was warm, as if it had been on for hours. I told myself it was normal. The owners must have come by before I arrived. Still, when I looked around the empty lobby, I felt the weight of the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It felt careful. Behind the desk, there was a narrow hallway that led to a small office and a staff bathroom. To the left of the lobby, an archway opened into a dark dining room filled with stacked chairs. To the right, a wide staircase curved upward, disappearing into shadow. The upper floors were closed, I'd been told. No guests, no bookings, just me. I signed into the computer and found a simple spreadsheet. No reservations, no expected arrivals. My job was to log the hours, check the security cameras every 30 minutes, and stay until sunrise. That was it. The cameras were old but working. There were 8 feeds: the parking lot, the front door, the lobby from a corner angle, the hallway behind the desk, the dining room, the stairwell, and 2 cameras upstairs on the second-floor hallway. I stared at those last 2 longer than the others. The second-floor lights were on, soft and yellow like the lobby. I remembered what the man had said. No one else is supposed to be there. Supposed to be. That wording came back to me then, slow and uncomfortable. I checked the time, 11:07 p.m. My shift had just begun. For the first hour, nothing happened. I listened to the low hum of electricity moving through old wires. Sometimes the building made small settling sounds, faint creaks that echoed through the walls. I tried reading a book I'd brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the camera screen. At 11:30, I did my first full check. Parking lot empty. Front door closed. Lobby still. Dining room unchanged. Stairwell quiet. Second floor hallway. I leaned closer. The camera angle was long and narrow, showing a stretch of carpet and several closed doors on either side. The lights glowed steadily. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near the far end. A shadow, maybe. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was compression from the old camera, a glitch. These systems weren't new. Still, I kept watching. Nothing else moved. Midnight came slowly. The highway outside grew silent. Fewer cars passed. The trees stopped rustling. Even the hum of the lights seemed softer, like the building was holding its breath. At 12:14 a.m., the front desk phone rang. The sound cut cleanly through the quiet. I jumped in my chair. No one was supposed to call. The line wasn't even listed publicly anymore, according to the man who hired me. It rang again. I stared at it for a full 5 seconds before picking up. "Briarwood Inn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. Not the kind with static or breathing. Just space. "Hello," I tried again. There was a faint sound then, not a voice, more like fabric shifting against a receiver, a soft brushing noise. My chest tightened. Is someone there? The line clicked. Dead. I kept holding the phone to my ear long after the call ended. The dial tone eventually returned, steady and normal, like nothing had happened. I slowly set the receiver down. I checked the call log on the computer. No incoming call registered. I told myself it had to be an internal system glitch, old wiring, crossed lines. That explanation felt thin. At 12:30, I checked the cameras again. Everything looked the same, except the second-floor hallway. One of the doors at the far end was open. Just slightly. I was certain it had been closed before. I stared at the image, trying to remember. Maybe I'd missed it. Maybe it had always been cracked open like that. The light inside the room was off, but the hallway light spilled in through the gap. The darkness beyond the door looked thick. I felt a slow pressure building in my head, like a quiet warning. No one else is supposed to be there. I stood up from the desk. For a long time, I just stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps above me, no doors shutting, no voices. Only that steady electrical hum. I don't know why I decided to go upstairs. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to feel afraid in an empty building. Or maybe some part of me needed to prove that nothing was wrong. I grabbed the small flashlight from the drawer, even though the lights were on. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed. Each step felt louder than it should have. The air grew cooler halfway up, carrying that same faint sweetness I'd noticed earlier, stronger now. The second-floor hallway stretched out in front of me, exactly as it had on the screen. Long, narrow, too quiet. The lights flickered once, gently then steadied. I walked slowly toward the open door. The carpet muffled my steps. My heartbeat felt heavy in my ears. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The other doors along the hallway weren't just closed. They were sealed. Thin strips of tape ran across their frames, old and yellowed, like someone had tried to make sure they stayed shut. But the open door at the end had no tape. I stopped a few feet away. The room number on the plaque read 214. I don't know why, but the number made my stomach drop. I pushed the door open with 2 fingers. The room inside was dark except for the hallway light spilling across the floor. Dust covered everything. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets looked stiff with age. There was no sign anyone had been inside recently. No footprints in the dust. No open windows. Nothing. I stepped in fully and shined the flashlight around. The beam passed over the dresser, the small television, the closet door. Then it caught something on the nightstand. A phone. An old landline phone, matching the one at the front desk. I froze. I walked closer. The phone cord trailed down the side of the nightstand and disappeared into the wall. Slowly, I lifted the receiver. There was no dial tone, only that same empty space I had heard earlier. And then, very faintly, breathing, not loud, not rushed, just soft, steady breathing on the other end of a line that should not have been connected to anything. My throat tightened, I couldn't speak. The breathing continued for 3 long seconds. Then it stopped. The line went completely silent. I placed the receiver back into its cradle with shaking hands. When I stepped back into the hallway, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't steady right away. They dimmed, and in that dimming light, halfway down the corridor, I saw something standing between the sealed doors. A shape, tall still, not moving toward me, not moving away. Just there, watching. I blinked and the lights brightened again. The hallway was empty. Every door sealed, except 214. I stood there for a long time, trying to slow my breathing. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe the lack of sleep was already getting to me. But as I walked back toward the stairs, I felt it. That careful silence again. Thicker now, closer, and somewhere deep in the walls of the Briarwood Inn, I heard a phone begin to ring. When I came back down the stairs, the ringing had already stopped. The lobby looked the same as before. Soft yellow lights, thick red carpet, the computer screen glowing patiently behind the desk. If someone had walked in right then, they would have thought it was just another quiet hotel on a slow night. But I knew better. My hands were still shaking when I sat down. I told myself I had imagined the shape in the hallway. Old lights flicker, shadows stretch. The mind fills in gaps when it's tired. That explanation almost worked, almost. I checked the cameras again. The second-floor hallway looked empty. Room 214's door was now closed. I leaned closer to the screen. I was certain I had left it open. A slow pressure built behind my eyes. I rewound the footage 10 minutes. The grainy video skipped back. I watched myself step out of 214, pull the door mostly shut behind me, then walk down the hall toward the stairs. The door never moved after that. No shadow. No figure. Just an empty hallway. I sat back in my chair and felt something settle inside my chest. Not relief, something heavier. Around 1:10 a.m., I decided I needed to understand the building better. If I was going to spend nights here, I couldn't let my imagination run wild. There had to be records, old files, something that explained why 214 felt different. Behind the front desk, inside the narrow office, there was a tall metal filing cabinet. It looked older than the computer system, older than the carpet even. A small key was taped to the top drawer. I hesitated before unlocking it. The drawer screeched softly when I pulled it open. Inside were folders stacked tightly together. Old invoices, repair reports, tax forms, most of them dated back years. The Briarwood Inn had officially closed in 2008, according to the papers. Renovation planning, one document said. But the renovation never happened. I flipped through more folders until I found something thicker than the rest. A leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked and dry, the edges dark with age. I carried it back to the desk. The first pages were neat, filled with careful handwriting. Guest names, room numbers, dates, payments. It went back decades. The ink changed color over the years from blue to black, sometimes fading to gray. I turned slowly through the entries. Most rooms had simple notes beside them. Checked in, checked out, paid in cash, paid by card. Room 214 appeared often. Nothing unusual at first. But when I reached the year 1993, the handwriting changed. It grew smaller, tighter, like the person writing had begun to press harder into the page. May 14, 1993. Room 214, Daniel Harper. Checked in 2 nights. I swallowed without meaning to. The next line was dated May 16. Room 214, Daniel Harper. No payment. No checkout. Just that. I flipped the page. There were more entries for other rooms after that date. Normal business, guests coming and going. But beside room 214, there was nothing else. No checked out, no vacated, no refund. Just empty space where the next entry should have been. My heart began to beat faster. I scanned the rest of the ledger. Every other room in the hotel had clean endings. Even when guests left early or skipped out on payment, there were notes, comments in the margins, follow-ups. Room 214 had none. It simply stopped. I closed the book and sat very still. I remembered the tape across the other doors upstairs, the yellow strips sealing them shut, as if someone had made a decision to close off that hallway, one room at a time. But 214 had been left untouched. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside were newspaper clippings. They had been folded carefully, but time had turned them brittle. I unfolded one slowly, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The headline read, "Local man missing after highway stop." The article was short. Daniel Harper, 32, last seen checking into a roadside in off County Route 6. His car found in the parking lot 2 days later. No signs of struggle. Personal belongings left in the room. No body recovered. The date matched the ledger. May 1993. I read the article twice. Police had searched the building, questioned staff. Nothing unusual found. The case eventually went cold. I felt the air shift around me. I looked up from the paper and stared at the staircase. No one else is supposed to be there. But in 1993, someone had been. And according to the ledger, he had never left. At 1:47 a.m., the front desk phone rang again. This time I didn't jump. I let it ring twice before picking up. Briarwood Inn. Silence. Then very faintly, a man's voice. Not clear enough to make out words, just the shape of speech, like someone talking from far away underwater. My throat felt dry. "Who is this?" The voice continued, low and slow. I strained to hear it. It sounded tired and confused. Then I heard a word. "Check out." The line crackled softly. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The word came again. "Check out." My chest tightened. "I can't help you," I said, though I didn't know why I was saying that. The voice faded. The line went dead. I kept holding the receiver long after the dial tone returned. Slowly, I placed it back. I turned to the computer and checked the internal phone system. There was a way to see which room had called the front desk. My hands moved carefully over the keyboard. The last incoming internal call, room 214. I stared at the screen. There were no active room lines. The system itself showed all rooms as disconnected since the closure, except 214. Its status read, occupied. My stomach dropped. I clicked into the settings. Under room status, every room was marked vacant, except 214. It was marked in-house. The check-in date field was blank. The checkout date field was blank. It looked less like a glitch and more like an unfinished sentence. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Maybe someone had never updated the system properly. Maybe old data had been carried over from a previous database. There were logical answers. There had to be. But logic felt thin in that building. At 2:15 a.m., I found myself standing at the base of the staircase again. I hadn't planned to go back up. My feet had simply carried me there. The air felt cooler than before. As I climbed, I noticed something new. A faint smell of cologne. Not sweet like the lobby. Sharper, earthy. Fresh. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped. I listened carefully. And I heard it. Soft footsteps above me. Slow. Measured. Not running. Not hiding. Just walking. From one end of the hallway to the other. I stood frozen, gripping the railing. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I forced myself to move. At the top of the stairs, the hallway lights were dimmer than before. Not flickering, just weaker, like they were tired. Room 214's door was open again. Wider this time. The other doors remained sealed. I stepped forward slowly. The air felt heavy, thick in my lungs. As I reached the doorway, I noticed something on the carpet just inside the room. Footprints. Not dusty like the rest of the floor. Clean, fresh, leading from the bed to the door, and stopping exactly where I stood. I looked down at my own shoes. They didn't match. These prints were from dress shoes, narrow, formal. The kind a man might wear to a business meeting or a funeral. My heart pounded in my ears. I lifted my eyes slowly. The bed was no longer neatly made. The sheets were turned down on one side, as if someone had just gotten up. And on the nightstand, the phone receiver was off the hook, hanging gently against the wood. I didn't hear breathing this time. I heard something softer, a voice barely there, right behind me, still occupied. The words were not loud. They were not angry. They were simply stated, like a fact. The lights flickered once more, and for a brief moment, I saw him reflected in the dark television screen across the room. A man in a suit, standing just behind my shoulder, waiting to be checked out. The first night it happened, I told myself it was just a pattern. Old buildings have rhythms. Pipes knock at the same hour. Air shifts through broken vents in steady cycles. When you sit alone long enough, you start to notice things that were always there. But this was different. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the bathroom light in room 214 turned on. I know the time because I was staring at the computer screen when it changed. 2:13. The hallway camera showed the door to 214 closed. The crack beneath it was dark. 2:14. A thin line of white light appeared under the door. Soft at first, then steady. I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't gone back upstairs since seeing the reflection in the television. I had stayed at the desk, watching the monitors, trying to convince myself that exhaustion could explain everything. But I knew one thing clearly. The wiring in that room had been cut. Earlier that evening, before my shift started, I had asked the man who hired me why only certain lights were on upstairs. He had laughed in a flat way and told me half the building wasn't even connected to the breaker anymore. Too expensive to fix, he'd said. Second floor bathrooms especially. Dead lines, haven't worked in years. Dead lines. I kept staring at the glow under the door on the monitor. It didn't flicker. It didn't dim. It just stayed on. After a few minutes, I forced myself to breathe slowly. There had to be a reason. Maybe emergency lighting. Maybe a separate power source I didn't know about. At 2:20, I stood up. My legs felt weak as I walked toward the stairs. I hated that I kept going back up there. It felt less like bravery and more like being pulled by something quiet and steady. The staircase creaked under me again, the same old wood sounds. Familiar now, almost comforting. Halfway up, I paused. I could see the faint glow at the end of the hallway, even before I reached it. Room 214 was lit from within. The rest of the hallway remained dim and yellow. When I stepped onto the carpet, I noticed something else. The air felt warmer near that room. Not by much, just enough to feel wrong. I walked slowly toward the door. As I got closer, I could hear a faint sound. Not footsteps, not breathing. Water, a soft, steady dripping. I stopped just outside the door and listened carefully. Drip, pause, drip. It was coming from inside the bathroom. My hand hovered near the doorknob. I told myself that if the light was on, if water was running, then something physical had to be causing it. Electricity doesn't appear from nowhere. Pipes don't move on their own. I turned the knob. The door wasn't locked. The main room was dark, just like before. The bed was unmade now, sheets wrinkled as if someone had slept there for weeks. The only light came from the bathroom at the far end. Bright, white, too clean for this old place. I stepped inside fully. The carpet felt slightly damp under my shoes. That made my stomach twist. The bathroom door was open. The light above the mirror glowed steadily. I could see the edge of the sink, the corner of the bathtub. Drip. Pause. Drip. I walked toward it slowly. When I reached the doorway, I leaned in just enough to see the sink. The faucet was turned slightly. Water fell in slow, patient drops into the basin. The mirror above the sink was fogged. Not fully, just in the center, like someone had recently stood there breathing against it. My chest felt tight. I stepped into the bathroom. The air inside was warmer than the bedroom, thick, humid. I reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it down. Nothing changed. The light stayed on. I flipped it up again. Still on. I knelt slowly and opened the cabinet under the sink. Exposed pipes. No visible wires running up the wall. I wasn't an electrician, but even I could tell the wiring had been stripped back years ago. The ends were capped and dusty. Dead lines. I stood up and stared at the bulb above the mirror. It didn't flicker. It didn't buzz. It just shone. Drip. Pause. Drip. I turned the faucet handle tight. The dripping stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had. I looked up at the mirror. The fog in the center was fatting slowly. And beneath it, faintly written in the condensation, were numbers. 214. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't written that. I was certain. The numbers were uneven, as if traced by a finger. The lines wobbled slightly. 214. I stared at them until they disappeared as the glass cleared. When the mirror was fully dry, there was nothing there. Just my reflection. Pale, eyes too wide, standing alone in a bathroom that should not have had power. I stepped back into the bedroom. The moment I crossed the threshold, the bathroom light went out. Instantly, the room fell into darkness, except for the faint hallway glow. I froze. Slowly, I turned back toward the bathroom. Pitch black. I reached for the switch again and flipped it. Nothing. I tried the faucet. No water came out. The pipes groaned faintly, but nothing flowed. I felt something settle deep in my stomach. This wasn't random. It wasn't broken wiring. It was a schedule. At 2:14 a.m., the light turned on. Water ran. The mirror fogged. And then it stopped. I backed out of the room carefully and closed the door behind me. As I stood in the hallway, I noticed something new. The tape sealing the other doors had begun to peel. Not fully, just at the edges, as if the adhesive was weakening, or as if something inside had been pushing against it. I walked back down the stairs slowly, my mind replaying the image of the numbers on the mirror. 214, the same as the room number, the same as the time. A loop, over and over. When I reached the desk, I checked the camera footage from the hallway again. At exactly 2:14, the crack under 214's door glowed white. No one entered. No one left. But on the monitor inside the room, something else showed. The bedroom camera flickered briefly at 2:13. Then at 2:14, for less than a second, there was a shape in the bathroom doorway. Tall, still, facing the mirror. Then it was gone. The footage returned to normal. I sat back in my chair and stared at the time. 2:37 a.m. 23 minutes since it happened. My heart was still racing. I thought about Daniel Harper. Checked in May 14, 1993. Never checked out. What if 2:14 wasn't just a time? What if it was the moment something happened? The moment he realized he wasn't leaving. The thought made my hands feel cold. At 2:58 I heard it again. Not upstairs. Not through the phone. From behind me. A soft click. I turned slowly. The small staff bathroom door in the office hallway was slightly open. A thin line of white light shone from inside. I stood up slowly. I knew what I would see before I reached it. I walked down the narrow hallway, each step slow and careful. When I reached the door, I looked at my watch. 3:00 a.m. Not 2:14. Still, the light was on. I pushed the door open. The bathroom inside was small. One sink, one mirror, one old bulb overhead. The wiring here worked. I had used it earlier. But the air felt warm. Humid. I stepped closer to the mirror. The glass was fogged in the center. My heart began to pound again. Very slowly, as the condensation thinned, numbers appeared beneath it. Not 2:14. This time it read 2:13. I stared at it confused. Then before my eyes, the last digit changed. The 3 stretched into a 4. 2:14. And somewhere upstairs, faint and patient, water began to drip. I didn't sleep after that. Even when the sun came up and washed the parking lot in pale gray light, I didn't feel relief. Morning didn't chase away what happened at 2:14. It only made it look thinner, easier to doubt. By 7:00 a.m., my shift was over. I should have left. Instead, I stayed at the desk and searched for more about Daniel Harper. The office computer had limited internet access, slow and outdated. Still, I found old public records, archived newspapers, forums where people talked about unsolved cases like they were puzzles. Daniel Harper was 32 years old in 1993, insurance adjuster, divorced, no children. He had been driving through town on business, stopped for the night at the Briarwood Inn. He called his office at 9:40 p.m. to say he would finish paperwork in the morning. That was the last confirmed contact. 2 days later, housekeeping entered room 214 after complaints about water running nonstop. They found the sink dripping, the bed slept in, his suitcase unpacked neatly on the dresser. His wallet was on the nightstand. His car was still in the parking lot. But Daniel Harper was gone. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, no blood. Just gone. Police searched the building from top to bottom. They brought in dogs. They opened walls in the basement. They checked the woods behind the inn. Nothing. The case cooled within a year. Officially, he was listed as a missing person. Unofficially, people assumed he ran away. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the staircase. The sink dripping. The mirror fogging. 2:14. I thought about the tape on the other doors upstairs. The way it looked old but not untouched, edges curling as if something had shifted behind them, quietly staying in the walls. The thought came to me gently, not like a scream, more like a memory. When I was a child, I used to press my ear against the wall of my bedroom at night. I don't know why. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I just liked the feeling of listening to something bigger than myself. Sometimes I would hear faint scratches inside the drywall, small movements. My father told me it was just the house settling, or mice. Houses breathe, he said. They shift, they creak. They're never really empty. I stood up slowly. My shift had technically ended, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I climbed the stairs again in full daylight. The hallway looked less threatening in the morning. Sunlight pushed faint beams through the narrow windows at each end. Room 214's door was closed. The tape on the other doors had peeled further overnight. Thin gaps now visible between frame and wood. I walked straight to 214 and opened it. The room smelled different in daylight. Stale. Damp. The bed was still unmade. The bathroom light was off. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The quiet in there felt heavier than the hallway. I knelt near the wall beside the bed and pressed my ear against it. At first, nothing. Then faintly, a sound. Not dripping. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Measured. On the other side of the wall. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from above or below. It was inside the wall itself. I pulled back quickly, heart pounding. It stopped. I waited. Silence. I placed my ear back against the drywall. Nothing. I moved to another section of the wall, closer to the bathroom. There it was again. Faint. Steady. Like someone resting quietly in a narrow space. My skin prickled. There shouldn't be space in those walls wide enough for a person. The building was old brick outside, but inside it had thick partitions. Still, something felt hollow. I stood up and looked around the room more carefully. The wallpaper near the corner by the closet was slightly uneven. The pattern didn't line up perfectly. A thin vertical line ran from ceiling to floor. I ran my fingers along it. The surface felt slightly softer than the rest, as if it had been opened before. My breath felt shallow. I went back downstairs and searched the office for maintenance records, blueprints, anything showing the layout of the building. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, beneath old tax forms, I found a rolled-up set of floor plans. The paper was yellowed but readable. I spread it across the desk. Room 214 sat at the far end of the second floor. Behind its north wall, according to the blueprint, there was supposed to be a maintenance shaft, a narrow service space for plumbing and electrical lines. It connected vertically from basement to attic. Access panels were marked only in staff areas, not in guest rooms. I traced the lines with my finger. If someone had opened the wall from inside 214, they could reach that shaft. They could move unseen between floors. My mouth felt dry. I went to the basement. The air down there was colder, heavier with dust and mildew. Rows of old pipes ran along the ceiling like metal veins. I found the base of the maintenance shaft near the boiler. There was a metal panel bolted into place, but the bolts were newer than the rest. Shinier. I touched one. Loose. My pulse thudded in my ears. I turned the bolt slowly. It came free with little effort. One by one, I removed them. The panel creaked softly as I pulled it open. Inside was darkness, and a narrow vertical space just wide enough for a person to stand. I shined my flashlight upward. Wooden beams, pipes, wires, and something else. Scratches along the interior walls. Long, uneven marks, like fingernails dragged down wood. My stomach turned. At the base of the shaft on the dusty floor lay something small and dark. I crouched and picked it up. A button. Black. Simple. The kind found on a suit jacket. I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel Harper had checked in wearing business clothes. The articles mentioned it briefly. Gray suit, black tie. I felt the air in the basement shift slightly. A faint movement above. Not loud. Just a subtle creak of wood. I looked up into the shaft again. For a second, I thought I saw something move in the darkness. A shadow passing across a higher beam. Then stillness. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. Someone has been quietly staying in the walls. The words felt true now. Not dramatic. Not impossible. Just true. I backed away slowly and replaced the panel loosely, not bolting it shut. When I returned upstairs, the hallway felt different. Less empty. Room 214's door was open again. Just a crack. I hadn't left it that way. The other door's tape had peeled almost completely off now, thin strips hanging like dead skin. I stepped toward 214 carefully. As I reached the doorway, I heard it clearly. Breathing. Not from the wall this time. From inside the room. Slow. Calm. Like someone asleep. I pushed the door open wider. The bed was no longer empty. The sheets rose and fell gently at the center, as if someone lay beneath them. I couldn't see a body shape clearly. Just the motion. Up and down. Up and down. My mind tried to reject it. Air movement. Drafts. Anything else. But the windows were closed. The air was still. The breathing continued. And then slowly the sheets flattened. The motion stopped. Silence filled the room. I stood frozen. After a long moment, I stepped closer to the bed. The indentation in the mattress remained. A clear outline where weight had been. But no one was there. I swallowed hard. Behind me, from inside the wall near the closet, I heard a faint shifting sound. Wood against wood. Then a soft whisper. Not angry. Not cruel. Just tired. Checked out. A pause. But not gone. I took the security job because it was simple. That's what the agency told me. 12-hour overnight shifts. Walk the halls. Check the doors. Make sure no one breaks in before demolition starts next month. The building had been empty for years. No power to most floors. No furniture left except what was too heavy to move. It used to be called the Grand Meridian Hotel. People said it had once hosted weddings so large the music could be heard 3 blocks away. Politicians gave speeches in the ballroom. Famous singers performed on its stage. There were chandeliers that looked like upside-down gardens made of crystal. Now it was just waiting to be torn down. When I arrived on my first night, the sky was already dark. The hotel stood at the edge of downtown, surrounded by chain-link fencing and orange warning signs. The windows were mostly boarded up. A single portable floodlight cast pale light across the entrance. I unlocked the temporary security office set up in what used to be the concierge desk. The air inside smelled like dust and old carpet. Not rotten, just forgotten. The power worked in limited areas. Emergency lighting in the hallways, the basement, and strangely the ballroom. The foreman had mentioned that. Don't worry about the ballroom, he'd said earlier that day. Old wiring in the sound system. Sometimes it hums when the generators kick in. It's harmless. Harmless. That word felt thin the moment I stepped inside. The lobby ceiling stretched high above me, though most of the decorative panels had been removed. The grand staircase still curved upward, but its railing was wrapped in plastic sheeting. My boots echoed softly as I walked across the marble floor. I checked the time. 11:08 p.m. My first patrol began. The hallways on the ground floor were stripped down to bare walls in some sections. Wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin. Doors to former guest rooms hung open, empty inside. Every sound I made came back to me a second later, slightly warped by the emptiness. Halfway through my first round, I heard it. A low hum. Faint. Steady. It wasn't coming from the lights. It wasn't the buzz of a loose wire. It sounded like speakers warming up. The kind of hum you hear before music begins. I stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came from the far end of the lobby, from the ballroom. I stood still for a moment, letting my breathing slow. I reminded myself of what the foreman said. Old sound system, generator interference. Still, I felt something shift inside my chest. The ballroom doors were tall and heavy, made of dark wood with gold trim that had faded to dull bronze. One of them stood slightly open. A thin line of pale light spilled out across the dusty floor. I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The ballroom was enormous. Even empty, it felt crowded with memory. The chandeliers had been removed, leaving only metal hooks hanging from the ceiling. The dance floor was scuffed and dull. At the far end of the room stood a raised stage. On either side of it were large black speakers. And from those speakers came the hum. Low, almost gentle. I walked slowly across the floor, my boots stirring small clouds of dust. The sound didn't grow louder as I approached. It stayed at the same soft level, like it wasn't meant to fill the room, just to exist inside it. I reached the stage and looked up at the speakers. They were old. Thick cords trailed down behind them into a wall panel that had been removed. The wiring inside looked cut, loose ends capped with plastic. No connection. No power source. Yet the hum continued. I stepped back slowly. For a moment, I imagined the room filled with people, tables draped in white cloth, glasses clinking, laughter echoing off the high ceiling, music starting softly before rising into something bright and joyful. The hum almost sounded like that, like the beginning of a song that never arrived. I checked my watch. 11:42 p.m. I pulled out my radio and reported that the ballroom speakers were active again. The supervisor on the other end sounded bored. "Yeah, they do that," he said. "It'll stop." I didn't ask how speakers with no wiring could hum. I just said copy and ended the call. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The stage curtains, which had been tied back and secured weeks ago, were slightly parted in the center, just enough to create a narrow gap. I stood there staring at it. Maybe air had moved them. Maybe someone forgot to tie them properly. I told myself that, but the air in the ballroom felt still. I walked up the steps to the stage. The wood creaked faintly under my weight. The hum continued. I reached the curtain and gently pulled it aside. Behind it was nothing but the bare brick wall of the building. No hidden doors, no extra space. Still, the feeling that I was interrupting something lingered. I let the curtain fall back into place. When I stepped off the stage, I noticed the hum had changed slightly. Not louder, just layered, as if a second tone had joined the first. Almost like two notes trying to find harmony. I stood in the center of the ballroom and listened. The sound pressed gently against my ears. Not painful, just persistent. It made my thoughts feel slower, thicker. I shook my head and forced myself to continue my patrol. The second floor was darker. Emergency lights cast long shadows down the corridor. My flashlight beam slid over cracked mirrors and abandoned housekeeping carts. At the far end of the hall, I found a door that led to a small balcony overlooking the ballroom. I opened it carefully. From above, the ballroom looked even larger and emptier. The hum rose up toward me, steady and patient. As I leaned on the railing, I noticed something strange on the dance floor below. Footprints, faint but visible in the dust. They formed a loose circle in the center of the room, as if several people had once stood there. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't fresh enough to be clear, just impressions, overlapping shapes. But I knew I hadn't seen them earlier from the ground. My stomach tightened. The hum shifted again. For a brief moment, it almost sounded like distant music. Not a melody, just the suggestion of one. I listened closely, and beneath the hum, I thought I heard something else. Breathing. Slow. Collective. Like a crowd holding its breath before applause. I stepped back from the railing. The balcony floor creaked under my weight. The hum deepened slightly. I told myself it was the building settling. Old hotels remember sound. They absorb it into the walls. Maybe this place was just releasing what it had held for decades. That explanation almost comforted me. Until midnight. At exactly 12:00 a.m., the hum stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and complete. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath. Then from the speakers on the stage, a single soft note played. Clear. Perfect. Like the first key pressed on a grand piano. It echoed across the ballroom and dissolved into the air. I gripped the balcony railing tightly. No generators had switched on. No lights changed. Just that one note. Then the hum returned. Quieter now. As if satisfied. I stayed on the balcony longer than I meant to, watching the circle of footprints below. For a moment, I thought I saw one of them deepen slightly, as if fresh weight had pressed down. But when I blinked, it looked the same. Empty. Still, when I finally made my way back to the security desk, I felt different. Not frightened exactly. More aware. Like the building had noticed me. As I sat down and began logging my first night's report, the hum from the ballroom continued in the distance. Steady, patient, almost welcoming. And somewhere deep in the walls of the once grand hotel, I had the quiet feeling that the music had been waiting for someone to guard it. I didn't go looking for the history of the hotel. It found me. On my third night, the hum in the ballroom started earlier than usual. Not at 11, not at midnight. It began at 10:32 p.m., just as I finished my first round of the lobby. It was softer than before, almost shy. Like it was testing the air. I stood near the concierge desk and listened to it travel through the marble floor and up into my boots. I told myself I would ignore it that night. Just log it. Just treat it like faulty wiring. But something about the tone felt different. There was a tremble in it now. A thin vibration that made the back of my neck feel tight. I walked to the ballroom again. The doors were closed this time. Both of them. I was sure I had left one slightly open during my earlier patrol. I pushed them apart slowly and stepped inside. The air felt heavier than before, warmer. The hum filled the space, low and steady, but underneath it I thought I heard a rhythm. Not clear music, just the shape of it, like a memory trying to play through broken speakers. The circle of footprints in the center of the dance floor was darker now, more defined. I crouched down and ran my gloved finger along one of the marks. Fresh dust had shifted. Something had stood there recently. I felt that same quiet awareness again. Like the room was not empty. I turned toward the stage. The curtains were fully closed now, tied neatly at the sides. But I hadn't done that. I walked up the steps slowly. The hum deepened slightly with each step. I don't know how to explain it, but the sound felt responsive, like it noticed when I moved. Behind the stage, near the old control booth, there was a small office I hadn't explored yet. The door was half hidden by stacked folding chairs. I squeezed past them and pushed it open. The room smelled like paper and old coffee. A metal desk sat in the center. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A corkboard hung crookedly above the desk, still pinned with yellowed papers. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it across the room. That's when I saw the clippings. They were pinned carefully in a cluster. Newspaper articles, faded and brittle. The headline on the largest one read, "Bride vanishes during reception at Grand Meridian." The date was June 17, 1978. I felt my chest tighten. I stepped closer and read slowly. The article described a wedding reception held in the ballroom, nearly 200 guests, a live band, a grand entrance down the staircase, photographs taken beneath the chandeliers. At 9:14 p.m. during the first dance, the bride reportedly stepped away from her groom. Witnesses said she looked pale, distracted. She told her husband she needed air. She walked toward the edge of the dance floor. And then she was gone. No one saw her leave the room. No one saw her enter the hallway. She simply disappeared in the middle of music and applause. The band kept playing for several seconds before the guests realized she wasn't there. Panic followed. Police searched the hotel from basement to roof. They found her veil near the stage, but nothing else. No signs of struggle. No broken windows. No blood. Just a bride who never returned. I swallowed slowly. The hum in the ballroom seemed to shift as I read. Another clipping described how the wedding quickly turned into a crime scene. Guests were questioned. Staff detained for hours. The groom reportedly fainted during questioning. He later told reporters he felt her hand slip from his during the dance, like she had stepped backward into darkness. The case went cold within months. Some believed she ran away. Others whispered about secrets. But no body was ever found. I leaned back against the desk and closed my eyes for a moment. June 17, 1978. I did the math quickly. Nearly 50 years ago. The hotel had stayed open for decades after that. Business continued. Weddings continued. Music continued. But something about that night had remained pinned to this corkboard, hidden in a back office no one used anymore. I looked around the small room again. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust, sat an old guest book. I opened it carefully. Most pages were blank, but near the middle, I found signatures dated June 17, 1978. Guests leaving notes for the bride and groom. Beautiful ceremony. Perfect night. Dance forever. The final message stopped halfway through a sentence. Wishing you both a lifetime of. The ink trailed off, as if the pen had been lifted suddenly. I felt a faint chill pass through me. The hum outside deepened again. This time, it was joined by something softer. A faint waltz rhythm. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I stepped back into the ballroom. The sound wrapped around me gently. Not loud, just present. The circle of footprints in the center of the dance floor had grown clearer. There were 2 distinct sets now, facing each other, as if 2 people stood mid-dance. I walked slowly toward them. My boots echoed lightly. The hum shifted into something almost melodic. I could imagine a violin somewhere above the ceiling, playing a slow, careful tune. I stopped just outside the circle. The dust inside it looked disturbed, as if movement had continued there long after the guests fled. I stared at the space between the 2 sets of prints, and for a moment I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, just a suggestion. A white shape turning slowly, fabric catching light, a hand lifting into the air. Then nothing. The hum steadied again. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. I thought about the bride stepping away from her groom, about her veil found near the stage, about her hand slipping free. I looked toward the stage curtains. They were slightly parted now, not tied, just open enough to reveal darkness behind them. I walked toward them slowly. Each step felt heavy. The music shape beneath the hum grew clearer. A slow waltz. Gentle. Endless. I reached the stage and climbed the steps. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. I pulled the curtain aside. Behind it was only brick wall. But the air felt different there. Cooler, as if something had passed through recently. I stepped back down to the dance floor. The two sets of footprints had shifted. Closer together now. Almost touching. I felt a strange sadness rise in my chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like grief. Like the room itself was remembering. I checked my watch. 9:14 p.m. I stared at it. That couldn't be right. When I had entered the office, it was after 10. Slowly in front of my eyes, the numbers changed. 9:15. 9:16. Time was moving forward again. The hum softened. The waltz rhythm faded back into a low, steady tone. The footprints in the center of the floor began to blur as dust settled gently over them. I stood alone in the ballroom. Empty. Silent except for that faint hum. As I walked back toward the doors, I noticed something near the edge of the dance floor. A small piece of white fabric, half buried in dust. I knelt and picked it up carefully. It was thin, delicate, lace, not old enough to crumble, not new enough to shine. I held it in my hand for a long moment. Then softly from somewhere above the stage, I heard a whisper. Not loud, not sharp, just breath shaped into words. May I have this dance? The hum deepened again, and I understood something then. The wedding hadn't ended. The music hadn't stopped. It had just been waiting for someone else to step into the circle. My final shift was supposed to be easy. Demolition crews were arriving the next morning. My job was just to make sure no one slipped inside during the night. After that, the Grand Meridian would belong to machines and dust. I told myself I was relieved. No more humming speakers. No more footprints. No more late-night research into things that never made sense. But when I parked outside the fenced entrance that evening, I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to hesitation. The building stood dark against the sky, its windows like blank eyes. The portable floodlight near the entrance flickered once before steadying. For a second, I imagined the hotel didn't want me to come in. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The lobby smelled the same. Old marble, dust, faint traces of perfume that had soaked into the walls decades ago. I checked my watch. 10:58 p.m. The hum hadn't started yet. That felt wrong. Usually by now, the ballroom speakers would already be awake, warming the air with that low, steady tone. Tonight there was nothing. Just silence. I made my first patrol slowly, almost cautiously. The hallways were still. The emergency lights cast pale strips along the floor. Plastic coverings on the staircase rail rustled slightly in the air from the vents. Everything looked ordinary. Too ordinary. When I reached the ballroom doors, I paused. No light spilled from beneath them. No sound leaked through the cracks. I pushed them open gently. The ballroom was completely dark. I stepped inside and swept my flashlight across the floor. Dust drifted through the beam. The stage stood bare. The speakers on either side looked like heavy black shadows. No hum. No rhythm beneath it. Just quiet. I felt a strange ache in my chest. Like walking into a house after someone has moved out. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the emptiness. Good, I whispered to myself. It's done. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. Not from the speakers. From somewhere higher. A faint violin note. Soft. Almost shy. I froze. The note lingered in the air, trembling gently before fading. Then another followed. A second note slightly lower. I turned slowly in a circle, trying to locate it. It wasn't coming from the stage. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was drifting from above. From the ceiling. I stepped backward until I stood in the center of the dance floor. The sound grew clearer. A slow waltz. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. The same rhythm I had heard before. Only now it wasn't hidden beneath a hum. It was music. Soft and distant, like it was playing in another room. I looked up toward the ceiling where the chandeliers used to hang. For a moment I imagined them there again, crystal catching light, gold reflecting candle flames, the room filled with guests dressed in suits and gowns. The music swelled slightly. Not loud, just present. My flashlight flickered once. I tightened my grip on it. The air felt warmer around me. Heavier. I looked down at the floor. The dust at my feet was shifting. Not blowing. Not disturbed by wind. It was moving in slow circles, as if guided by something unseen. The faint outlines of footprints began to appear again. 2 sets, facing each other. I took a step back. The music grew clearer. A violin joined by a soft piano. No speakers were active. I knew that. The wires had been cut, but the sound wrapped around me anyway. I felt my pulse in my ears. And then I saw it. At the far edge of the dance floor near the stage, something moved. Not fast. Not sudden. A pale shape turning slowly. I blinked hard. It remained. A figure in white. The outline soft and blurred, like light seen through fog. She was turning in place. Slowly. One hand lifted slightly, as if resting on someone's shoulder. But no one stood with her. The space across from her was empty. Yet the dust there shifted too, as if weight pressed down on the floor. My breath felt shallow. "I'm not staying," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. The music continued. The figure drifted gently toward the center of the room. Her dress moved as if brushed by a soft breeze that I could not feel. Her head tilted slightly. Listening. Waiting. I took another step back. The door behind me felt farther away than it should have. The music swelled again, just a little. And then from the empty space across from her, I saw it. A shadow forming. Faint at first, then clearer. The outline of a man in a suit. His features blurred, like they had never fully decided on a face. He lifted his hand. She placed hers in it. They began to move together. Slowly, perfectly in rhythm. The dust beneath their feet swirled into clearer patterns now. Circles within circles. My heart pounded hard enough to make me dizzy. This wasn't a jump or a shock. It was worse. It felt gentle, like I had walked into something private, something that had been happening long before I arrived. They turned once, twice. The music softened into something almost tender. I could see the bride's veil trailing behind her, catching light that didn't exist. I thought about the groom who had fainted that night in 1978. I thought about the guests who had left in panic. Maybe she hadn't vanished. Maybe she had simply stayed, waiting for the dance to finish. The shadow of the man leaned closer to her, their heads almost touching. For a brief moment, the room felt full. Not crowded, but occupied, alive with quiet presence. I took another step backward. The flashlight in my hand dimmed slightly. I felt something brush past my shoulder. Not a hand, not fabric, just the faintest shift in air, as if someone else had stepped onto the floor behind me. The music changed. It grew slightly faster. Urgent. The couple in the center turned more quickly now. The bride's dress flared outward. Her veil lifted as if caught in wind. I could feel the rhythm in my chest. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. And then slowly, her head turned toward me. Not fully. Just enough. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I felt her gaze. Not angry. Not pleading. Just aware. The shadow of the man continued to guide her in slow circles. The music softened again, almost fading. The lights in the ballroom flickered once, and in that brief flicker, the room looked full. Tables set, chairs occupied, guests watching, faces turned toward the dance floor. When the light steadied, they were gone. Only the couple remained. They slowed. The music drifted toward its final notes. The bride leaned slightly into her partner. The shadow held her steady. Then gently, they began to fade. Not vanish suddenly, just thinning, like smoke in still air. The music lingered on one final note. Soft, clear, perfect, then silence. The dust settled slowly back onto the floor. The ballroom returned to darkness. Empty. I stood there for a long time, listening to my own breathing. The hotel felt still again, but not abandoned. More like complete. I walked slowly toward the doors. Before I stepped through them, I turned back once more. The dance floor looked untouched. No footprints. No circles. Just dust. As I closed the ballroom doors behind me, I heard it one last time. A single violin note. Faint, almost grateful. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the building stood quiet behind me. No hum, no music, just brick and shadow. But as I locked the gate and walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that inside that dark ballroom, beneath layers of dust and time, the dance had finally reached its end. Or perhaps it had simply found a new partner for one more song. I took the job because I needed the money. That's the simple truth. The hotel had been closed for 8 years after a fire that never made much sense. Electrical fault, they said. Faulty wiring in the upper floors. But no one could explain why the fire started in 3 different places at once, or why the alarms never sounded. By the time I signed the contract, the building had already been sitting empty for almost a decade. The city wanted the power restored before selling it to a developer. My job was to inspect the old system and bring the lights back on, floor by floor. It was supposed to take 2 weeks. On my first night, I stood across the street and looked up at the building. 22 floors of dark windows stared back at me. The sign that once glowed above the entrance hung crooked, half the letters missing. The wind moved through the broken glass like someone breathing slowly in their sleep. I've worked in abandoned places before. Factories, warehouses, old schools. They all have a feeling, a kind of hollow quiet, but this hotel felt different. It didn't feel empty. Inside, the lobby still held its shape. The marble floor was cracked but clean in places, like someone had walked careful paths across it. The front desk stood against the far wall, charred along one side. A chandelier hung above me, blackened by smoke, its crystals dull and gray. My boots echoed too loudly. I set my toolbox down and listened. There's a certain kind of silence you get in dead buildings, a flat, heavy silence, This wasn't that. This silence had layers. The low hum of distant wind in the elevator shaft, the soft tick of cooling metal, and beneath it all something softer, a faint electrical whisper like wires remembering what they used to carry. The power was supposed to be completely cut. I told myself it was just old current trapped in the lines, residual energy. Buildings hold onto things, heat, sound, smells. Maybe electricity too. I found the main breaker room behind the reception area. The door stuck halfway open, warped by heat from the fire. Inside, the panels were coated in soot. Some wires had melted together, fused like black veins. I worked slowly, methodical I always am. When you're alone in a place like that, routine becomes your anchor. Check the lines, test the circuits, replace what's damaged, don't rush. Around midnight, I restored partial power to the lobby. The lights didn't come on all at once. They flickered, dim at first like tired eyes adjusting, then brighter. For a moment I felt proud, like I'd brought something back to life. That feeling didn't last. As the light steadied, I saw the outlines on the walls. Shadows. Not random smoke stains, not cracks. Shadows shaped like people. Along the far wall of the lobby, near the ballroom entrance, dark silhouettes stretched across the wallpaper. Some looked like couples standing close together. One looked smaller, maybe a child. The edges were blurred, but the shapes were clear enough. I stepped closer. They weren't burn marks. The fire report had said the blaze never reached the lobby fully. Smoke damage only. I reached out and touched one of the shapes. The wall was cold. The shadow didn't smear or flake. It felt like part of the paint itself. I told myself it was coincidence. Human brains see patterns everywhere. Faces in clouds, figures in stains. Still, I turned the lights off. The lobby felt safer in the dark. I spent the next few nights working my way upward. Each floor had its own smell. Old carpet, wet plaster, something sweet and rotten underneath it all. Most rooms were stripped bare, mattresses gone, curtains removed, but sometimes I'd find things left behind. A high heel near the window, a suitcase in the closet, a toothbrush by the sink. It was as if people had meant to come back. On the 7th floor, I found the first door that wouldn't open. Room 714. The handle turned, but the door felt blocked from the inside. I knocked once just out of habit. The sound echoed down the hallway. Then very softly, I heard something knock back. Not loud, not aggressive. Just 2 gentle taps. I froze. Old pipes, I told myself. The building settling. I knocked again, 2 taps. Silence. I didn't knock a 3rd time. Instead, I marked the door with chalk and moved on. I told myself I'd come back later with tools. But I avoided that hallway for 2 days. By the end of the first week, I had restored power to half the building. Lights glowed in rows behind dirty windows, turning the hotel into a giant, uneven lantern against the night sky. From outside, it probably looked hopeful. Inside, it felt wrong. The elevators still didn't work, so I used the stairs. Every climb felt longer than the last. Sometimes, when I stopped to catch my breath, I thought I heard footsteps above me. Slow, measured, staying just out of sight. I began talking to myself while I worked. Just small things, counting tools, reading voltage numbers out loud. The sound of my own voice kept the air from pressing in too tight. On the 10th night, I restored power to the ballroom level. The fire had started somewhere near there, according to the reports. Electrical fault in the lighting rig. That's what they claimed. When the breakers clicked into place, the ballroom lights flickered on one by one. The room was enormous. A wide wooden dance floor stretched across the center. Round tables stood stacked against the walls. The ceiling arched high above, painted with faded gold patterns. For a second, everything looked almost normal. Then I noticed the floor. Across the wood, dark shapes spread in uneven circles, stains that no cleaning ever fully erased. I stepped onto the dance floor, my boots thudding softly. The air felt warmer there, heavier. I walked toward the center of the room, where the largest stain marked the wood. It was shaped strangely, like fabric caught mid-spin. And that's when I heard it. Music, faint, distant. A slow, old-fashioned waltz drifting through the air. I turned in a full circle, scanning the walls. The speakers were dead. The wiring to them hadn't even been replaced yet. The music wasn't loud. It was barely there, like something remembered instead of played. I felt it more than heard it. A rhythm pressing gently against my chest. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. My hands started to shake. I told myself it was tinnitus, stress, long hours alone. But then the lights above me flickered. Not randomly. In time with the music. Bright on the first beat. Dim on the second. Bright again on the third. I backed away slowly, my boots scraping across the wood. The air around me felt crowded, thick, as if bodies stood just inches away, moving in careful circles. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt watched, not in a sharp, sudden way, in a patient way, like the building had been waiting for the lights to come back. The music faded after a minute, the lights steadied, the room returned to silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the center of the dance floor. Then I turned off the breakers. The darkness rushed in quickly, swallowing the gold ceiling, the stained wood, the stacked tables. I left the ballroom and didn't look back. That night, as I locked the front doors behind me, I glanced up at the hotel's windows. Even with the power cut to that floor, I saw a soft glow near the center level, warm and yellow like candlelight. And for just a second, I thought I saw movement behind the glass. Two shapes turning slowly together. Dancing. I told myself it was reflection, streetlights, passing cars. But when I looked again, the glow was still there, waiting for me to come back and finish the job. On the 12th night, I decided to test the elevators. I had been avoiding them. The stairwells felt safer somehow, honest. You could see every step in front of you. You knew exactly where you were. Elevators were different. They closed you in. They moved you through the building without letting you see how. But the contract was clear. Full power restoration. That meant lifts too. The main elevator sat at the end of the lobby, its brass doors stained with smoke. I had already restored electricity to the shaft motors earlier that day. All that was left was testing the system from inside. I stood there for a long time before pressing the call button. The light above it blinked on. Somewhere deep in the building, gears shifted. A cable groaned. The sound echoed down the shaft like something waking up after a long sleep. The elevator car descended slowly. When the doors slid open, a stale breath of air drifted out. It smelled like dust and old perfume. Sweet, faint, almost gone. Inside, the mirrors were cracked but still hanging. The gold trim along the walls was scratched and blackened. The carpet had been removed, leaving only a square of bare metal floor. I stepped in. The doors closed behind me with a soft, final sound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the control panel lit up. Buttons from B to 22 glowed in a neat grid. All ordinary, all expected. There was no 13. I noticed that right away. Hotels sometimes skip that number. People do like it. They say it's bad luck. I've stayed in buildings where the elevator goes from 12 to 14 without explanation. Still, something about the smooth metal panel made me uneasy. It looked newer than the rest. Cleaner, as if it had been replaced at some point. I pressed 5. The doors closed tighter. The elevator hummed and began to rise. The movement felt steady, but my stomach tightened anyway. I watched the numbers above the door change one by one. The lights flickered as we passed 4. For half a second, the interior went dark. In that brief blackness, I felt something shift beside me. Not touching me. Just there. Then the lights came back on, and I was alone again. I told myself it was the power stabilizing. Old wiring, weak connections. The doors opened at 5. The hallway outside was empty and dim. I didn't step out. I just pressed 10. The doors closed again. Upward. Slow. I stared at the control panel. And that's when I saw it. A thin line along the right edge of the metal plate, almost invisible, like a seam. Curious, I leaned closer. There was a slight gap, no wider than a fingernail, running vertically beside the buttons. The surface looked flush, but not perfectly. I reached out and pressed along the edge. Nothing. I pressed harder. There was a soft click. A section of the panel shifted inward, barely noticeable, then slid sideways with a quiet mechanical sigh. Behind it, hidden in shadow, was a single button. It wasn't lit. It wasn't labeled in the same clean font as the others. The number looked older, slightly faded, the edges worn. My throat went dry. I stood there staring at it while the elevator continued its climb. The air inside felt heavier. Why hide it? If the building skipped 13 for superstition, why keep the button at all? The doors opened at 10. I didn't move. I couldn't stop looking at that hidden number. The elevator waited. Then slowly, without me touching anything, the doors closed again. The car began to move. Down. I hadn't pressed a floor. My heart started beating faster, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, calm, methodical. Maybe the system reset automatically. Maybe I'd leaned on something without noticing. The numbers above the door counted backward. But the descent didn't feel smooth anymore. It felt longer, as if the shaft had grown deeper. The display changed to 6, then 5, then 4. When it should have shown 3, the light flickered. For a moment, the display went blank. Then a single number appeared. The elevator jolted softly and stopped. I felt the stop in my knees. The doors did not open. I waited. Nothing. The air felt colder now, the faint smell of perfume stronger. I swallowed and reached toward the hidden button. My finger hovered just above it. I didn't want to press it. I don't know why. It was just a number, just a floor. But my body resisted, like it knew something my mind didn't. Before I could decide, the elevator gave a soft chime. The doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dark. Not dim. Dark in a way that swallowed the light from inside the car. The elevator's ceiling bulbs flickered weakly, casting only a few feet of visibility past the threshold. I stepped forward slightly, just enough to see out. The floor outside was carpeted in deep red, cleaner than the other levels. The pattern looked untouched by dust. The walls were lined with framed photographs. I couldn't see the details, but I could make out shapes. People standing in formal clothes, smiling. At the far end of the hallway, a chandelier hung from the ceiling. It was lit. Soft golden light swayed gently, though there was no breeze. I listened carefully. No wind. No pipes. Just a faint hum. And beneath it, so soft I almost thought it was memory, the distant rhythm of music. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. My chest tightened. This was wrong. There was no 13th floor in the blueprints. I had studied them myself before starting the job. 12 floors above the lobby, not 13. Yet here I was. I took one full step out of the elevator. The carpet felt warm under my boot. The doors behind me stayed open. The photographs along the wall came into clearer view. Wedding pictures, dozens of them. Different couples, different years. All taken in the same ballroom downstairs. The same gold ceiling. The same dance floor. In every photo, the bride smiled brightly. And in every photo, the groom's face looked slightly blurred. Not scratched out, just unclear, as if the camera had struggled to hold him in focus. My skin prickled. At the end of the hallway near the chandelier, I saw movement. Slow, a figure turning gently, as if dancing with someone just out of sight. The white of a dress caught the light, the shape of a veil. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear fabric move. Just that steady, patient rhythm. 1, 2, 3. I stepped backward. The elevator doors were still open behind me, but the interior looked darker now, smaller, like it was farther away than it should be. The figure at the end of the hall paused. Then slowly, it turned its head toward me. I couldn't see a face, just shadow beneath the veil. But I felt the attention settle on me. Not angry, not surprised, expectant, as if I had finally arrived where I was meant to be. The chandelier above flickered once. The music grew slightly louder. I took another step back, my heel catching the edge of the elevator floor. The doors began to close. Slowly, too slowly. I lunged backward into the car just as the gap narrowed. The doors sealed shut with a soft click. The music stopped. The display above the door flickered again. 13 vanished. The numbers reset to 12. The elevator jolted upward sharply this time, faster than before. My back hit the mirrored wall. I stared at my reflection. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me. Tall, still. Then the light steadied, and it was just my own pale face staring back. The elevator stopped at 12. The doors opened to the familiar dusty hallway. No red carpet, no chandelier, no photographs, just peeling wallpaper and the smell of mold. I stepped out slowly. When I turned back to look at the control panel, the hidden seam was gone. The metal plate was smooth. There was no 13 button, only the standard rose glowing softly. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. Deep down, I understood something I didn't want to admit. The building wasn't just broken. It wasn't just damaged by fire. It was layered, like something had been sealed inside it. And by restoring the power, I had given it a way to breathe again. I stepped off the elevator onto the 13th floor. At least, that's what the indicator had told me. The panel outside the elevator had long since lost any sense of logic. Sometimes it skipped numbers entirely. Sometimes the floors counted backward. But the doors opened, and the hallway stretched before me, carpeted in deep red that smelled faintly of smoke. The air was thick, heavier than the rest of the building. Not dusty like the floors below. Not damp. Warm, almost humid, like the room itself had exhaled and held its breath. I had never seen this floor in the plans. All documents, all blueprints labeled it non-existent. City inspectors, fire reports, even the demolition team, all said the hotel had 12 floors above the lobby. 12. And yet here I was. The hallway lights flickered faintly, not the standard emergency bulbs. These lights felt older, soft, as if decades of power had passed through them. They cast uneven shadows along the walls, stretching the corners into angles that didn't make sense. The wallpaper, once patterned gold and red, was blistered in places, melted, curled at the edges like paper left too close to fire. I stepped forward slowly. The carpet muffled my boots. Every sound felt amplified in the strange silence, even my breathing, which suddenly seemed too loud. Smoke, that's what I thought at first. Thin gray ribbons curling along the ceiling. But there was no heat, no smell of burning wood or plastic, just smoke, moving, like someone had exhaled long ago and the air refused to let it go. I pressed my hands against the wall. The wallpaper peeled slightly beneath my fingers. In some areas, it had melted against the plaster. The patterns distorted as if someone, or something, had tried to press through. I took a cautious step further, toward the end of the hallway. At the far wall, I noticed marks, blackened streaks along the corners where the wallpaper had been scorched. Not the wide, chaotic marks of a fire, but small, precise, like someone had traced shapes along the walls with heat. I crouched to inspect them. The plaster beneath was clean, untouched by water, unbroken. No reports had ever mentioned anything on this floor. The fire had supposedly never reached this high. Yet here were traces that something had burned quietly, deliberately. A faint draft tickled my ears, almost a whisper or maybe the building settling. I told myself that often. Buildings breathe, old plumbing, air currents, nothing more. But then I heard it. A soft crackle like paper burning. Behind me, not loud, not insistent, just there. I froze. The hallway behind me stretched in perfect symmetry. The elevator doors were closed at the far end. Nothing moved. Nothing should have moved. Another crackle, this time closer, echoing faintly off the walls. My heart started to hammer. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Step by step, logical. Check the marks. Take notes. Maybe the heat traces were from old wiring, from circuits fried long ago. I turned my flashlight across the walls. Shadows deepened in the corners, curling around the melted wallpaper. The burn marks formed patterns now. Not letters, not symbols, just swirls. Circles within circles, as if the heat had traced itself in some deliberate dance. The air felt alive, not like wind, not like air movement, like presence. Something observing quietly, waiting. I could feel it in my chest. A subtle pressure, like someone standing close behind me, but when I spun around, nothing was there. I pressed my hand to the floor. The carpet was warm, not from lights or heating, just warmth. And beneath the soft fibers, I felt a vibration, almost imperceptible, like the building itself had pulsed in recognition of me. The elevator doors creaked open suddenly. I jumped. Nothing visible inside. I knew it was empty. The car hadn't moved for hours, yet the doors swayed slightly, almost as if breathing. I tried to ignore it, focused on the marks. Then I noticed the wallpaper along the side walls rippling slightly. Not air movement. It moved in waves, subtle, slow, almost hypnotic. My chest tightened. I knew instinctively that I wasn't alone. The smell hit me then. Smoke, faint but distinct, not thick, not dangerous but familiar, like burning wood or metal. Memories of fire alarms, crackling fires in old kitchens, the smell of charred linens. I swallowed hard. I had been on other fire sites, seen actual flames consume rooms. This wasn't that, yet it felt the same. I shone the flashlight along the hallway. The burn marks seemed to deepen under the beam, shadows curling into themselves. The air thickened, pressing against my throat. I forced myself to step forward, one cautious foot at a time. At the end of the hallway, the last door stood slightly ajar. Heavy wood blackened at the edges. The brass handle had dulled, but I could see fingerprints in the dust. Fresh. Not weeks old, not decades old. Recent. I swallowed. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. It was warmer than it should have been. The door creaked open to reveal a small room, almost perfectly preserved. Not a hotel room, not like the others below. The walls were lined with photographs, yellowed but intact. Weddings, parties, dances, people smiling, posed elegantly. The chandelier above still had glass prisms, untouched by soot. A faint layer of dust covered the floor, but footprints pressed lightly into it. Then I saw the fire. Small, concentrated. It hadn't consumed the room, just scorched small areas. Burn marks along the carpet edges, melted wallpaper curling in tiny curls. The smell was stronger here, but still subtle. And that's when I saw the figure. Not fully formed, a shimmer like heat waves above pavement. It hovered near the center of the room, pale and indistinct, the veil of a dress soft and flowing, and the faintest outline of someone turning slowly, as if dancing with a partner I couldn't see. The hair on my arm stood straight. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My flashlight flickered. I forced myself to keep it steady, even as my knees felt weak. I whispered to myself logical words, just a trick of the light. Memory drafts, nothing more. But the smell persisted. Smoke that wasn't there. Heat that didn't exist. And the faint music now, almost imperceptible, threading through the crackle of burned wallpaper. 1, 2, 3. The figure turned slowly, endlessly, the dress spinning lightly with a windless motion. The shadows along the walls twisted, curling like fingers reaching from melted wallpaper. I realized then that this floor had never been included in any official plans for a reason. No inspector, no report, no developer wanted anyone to know it existed. Yet here I was, standing on a floor that shouldn't exist, in a hotel that had claimed to burn, watching echoes of lives that had been erased. The heat pulses, the burn marks, the smoke that wasn't there, they all belonged to something that had never left, waiting, patient, careful. I wanted to leave. I told myself I would step back, press the elevator, go down, and never speak of this. But the door behind me clicked, shut softly on its own. I felt it then, the weight of unseen eyes, the subtle pulse beneath the floor, and in that instant I understood. The hotel hadn't forgotten the fire. It had preserved it. Every flicker, every scorched mark, every breathless second of heat and smoke. And now it had me. I finally found the file cabinet tucked in the basement hallway, behind a set of old shelving units that had been shoved aside long ago. The basement smelled of damp concrete and mold, a faint tang of rust in the air. It wasn't unusual for a building this old, but tonight it felt different, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for me to open these drawers. The cabinet was metal, scratched and dented, but the drawers still slid smoothly. I pulled out the top one and flipped on my flashlight. Old papers spilled slightly onto the floor. Insurance claims, inspection reports, fire department logs. I had sifted through these documents before, but something about the way they were stacked tonight made me uneasy. I began to sort through them carefully. Most of the claims were straightforward. Guests reported theft, minor injuries, lost valuables. But then I reached a folder labeled Fire Incident, 1993 Guest List. The paper was yellowed, edges brittle, typed names, signatures, ages. The standard insurance file, nothing fancy. I scanned the list slowly. 23 guests accounted for, 4 staff, and one line that made my stomach tighten. Survivor unknown. I frowned. That wasn't unusual for a chaotic fire. Sometimes people left were unregistered or couldn't be identified. But then I noticed something strange. Further down the list, the same entry appeared again. Survivor unknown. 2 entries, identical. 2 survivors listed as unknown. No age, no gender, no room number. Just the same phrase repeated. I leaned back against the cabinet, heart beating a little faster. That's when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. This was an official insurance file. Every entry had been carefully verified. Staff interviews, police reports, fire inspectors' notes. This duplication wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate, or someone had wanted it to stay hidden. I flipped the folder over, hopping for notes, marginalia, something to explain it. Only a faint pencil mark, almost erased, traced under one of the unknown entries. I could barely make out a single word. Returned. I set the folder down and rubbed my face. The basement seemed colder now. The hum of the building's new power lines above me, which usually made me feel safe, sounded muted, distant, like it wasn't part of this floor at all. I reminded myself of the fire, how it had started in 3 separate places. The report said no one could explain it. 4 staff escaped. 23 guests, all accounted for except the missing ones, the unknowns. But why were there 2 entries for 1 survivor? Why would anyone hide it? I opened the next folder, labeled Guest Registrations, July 1993. Signatures, addresses, credit card numbers, nothing unusual, until I found 1 registration card missing the guest's name. Room 214. Same room I had already heard about from the older reports. The missing guest, the one who never checked out. I traced the details with my finger. The card was typed, not handwritten. The date, the night the fire started. Signature line blank. Emergency contact, none. Payment, processed but billed to the hotel's corporate account. A slow shiver ran down my spine. I took a deep breath. The first unknown survivor, possibly the missing guest. But then who was the second unknown? How could someone survive and remain unidentified, yet appear twice in the same official documents? I felt the air press closer. My flashlight beam caught the edges of the cabinet drawers again. In that reflected light, the walls seemed to shimmer slightly. The concrete was uneven, curling in faint shadows. I shook my head. Buildings make patterns in low light. Old walls bend shadows. It's nothing. But the faint sound came again. A scraping, soft, deliberate from somewhere deeper in the basement. Not footsteps, something slower, almost hesitant. I swallowed, kept my eyes on the files. The second unknown survivor seemed more real in that moment than anything else in the room. More present, watching, patient. I rifled through more files. Fire department reports. Nothing concrete. Guest lists were all accounted for except for the unknown entries. Death certificates for the other victims. Photographs of charred rooms. Stairs warped. Walls blackened. Smoke still clinging to corners that had never been scrubbed. One report caught my attention. Room 214 recovered unoccupied personal effects intact. No identifiable remains. Unusual patterns of burn observed. Cause undetermined. Patterns, not just fire. Patterns, shapes, heat traces, that room again. It wasn't just a missing guest. It wasn't just a fire. Something had been deliberately preserved or trapped inside that room. I pressed my palm to my forehead. I could feel my pulse thumping. My flashlight shook slightly in my hand. The basement door behind me groaned. The metal hinges protested, slow and low. Nothing should have been moving. I hadn't touched it. And yet the sound carried weight, a presence. I tried to focus. One file at a time. I couldn't look away from the names. The repeated unknown, the missing signatures, the blank registration card. A faint whisper brushed along my ear. Not words, just intention. A movement of air that felt too deliberate to be natural. I blinked. My vision swam slightly. The shadows along the ceiling seemed to shift, faintly curling downward. The burn patterns from the fire, the ones I'd only seen in photographs, appeared now in my mind. Circular, symmetrical, too precise to be random. One of the unknown entries, I could feel it, not just on paper but in the room. The faint, lingering warmth of fire, smoke that didn't exist, presence. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, methodically. One hand on the cabinet, one hand on the flashlight. I could ignore it if I stayed rational. But then a photo slipped from the folder, fell onto the concrete floor. I bent to pick it up. It was a group shot. Hotel staff, ballroom guests taken days before the fire. Everyone smiling, except one person. The face was blank, washed out. No eyes, no features, just a vague outline of a head and shoulders. My stomach turned. I stacked the files carefully, but that image lingered in my mind. The second unknown. The survivor who never existed officially, yet had been recorded. The blank face in the photograph. I could feel it in the walls now. That floor had layers. Floors below were empty. Standard reports. Routine cleanup. But here on this floor, and only in the files, something persisted. I heard the faint scrape again. Closer this time, not hurried, not frantic, patient, measuring, waiting. I backed toward the stairs. My boots echoed in the basement, sharp against the low hum of the building's restored power. I glanced at the file cabinet one last time. The top drawer shifted slightly. A slip of paper slid toward me. My flashlight caught the corner. Handwritten, almost illegible, one line. She never left, he never arrived. My breath caught. I didn't touch it, I couldn't. The words burned more than the paper could. They pressed against my skull, wrapped around my thoughts. The basement air thickened. Smoke that wasn't there curled upward toward the ceiling. Faint heat pulsed beneath my boots. The building, alive in ways I could not understand, pressed in, patient, expectant, observing. I fled, stairs creaking underfoot, heart hammering, ears ringing with a hum I knew wasn't electrical. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. I leaned against the wall of the service exit, gasping. The hotel loomed above me, silent and dark. I thought of the file, the repeated unknown, the blank face, the message on the slip of paper. I realized something that would not leave me. The fire hadn't finished. Not really. Not the way the building remembered. Not the way it had kept her alive or him waiting. And somewhere inside, in that preserved floor, in that record that didn't make sense, the survivors remained. Unseen, uncounted, waiting for someone to notice. I never went back to the basement after that night, but the papers, the photographs, and the repeated unknown haunted me. Because I knew. No matter what reports said, no matter what the city claimed, the hotel still had its survivors. And they were watching. I understood the pattern long before I wanted to. The elevator, once obedient to my buttons, began to move on its own. It didn't happen every trip, not every night, but often enough for me to notice and impossible to ignore. I would be on the first floor, pressing for the basement, the lobby, anywhere but up, and the car would hesitate. Then rise, steady, deliberate, smooth, and stop at the 13th floor. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, old wiring, failing circuits, some stray signal from the newly restored power, but my mind refused the comfort of logic. Every time the doors opened, the hallway stretched before me in that impossible red carpet, those photographs along the walls, that soft, fake warmth of a floor that officially shouldn't exist. And every time, someone stepped in. I never saw them clearly, I never wanted to. The elevator's mirrored interior should have shown a reflection. It didn't, not ever. Only the empty car. Only me, pale, sweating, hands trembling. It started small, a shadow at the edge of the mirrored wall, a brush of movement in the corner of my eye. I would look directly and nothing, just the polished metal and the soft hum of the motor. But the faint sense of another presence remained. The first night it happened, I was going down from the top floor. The car stopped. Soft chime. Doors opened. I felt it immediately. Someone else was inside. Warmth. Weight shifting subtly on the floor. My throat went dry. I glanced around. Empty. No reflection. I froze, my pulse in my ears. Heart hammering. The elevator closed. I pressed the first floor button. It obeyed, descending steadily. But I could feel them behind me. Patient. Waiting. Every few seconds, the faintest brush of air against my neck, my shoulder. The following nights were worse. I tried to avoid the elevator. I told myself I could take the stairs, but the hotel was old, tall, and at times unsafe. My legs ached. My boots slipped on worn steps. The elevator was faster, the only practical choice. So I rode. And every ride, inevitably it stopped at 13. Sometimes I pressed the buttons first. It didn't matter. The car obeyed the unseen orders. Doors opened. The air shifted. The faint heat and the smell of smoke that wasn't there wafted inside. And someone entered. I never saw them, never touched them, never heard footsteps. But the pressure they left behind was unmistakable. The car's weight sensors weren't sensitive enough to measure it. Yet I could feel it. A careful shift of air. a subtle pull in the vibrations beneath my boots. Someone was moving with me, invisible. I began timing it, almost every night 13. Exactly the same moment. The elevator had learned the rhythm. I could anticipate it. I could hear the soft hum of the motor change slightly before the doors opened, and always without fail that same absence. No reflection, no form, just presence. I tried talking once, whispered unsure, shaking, "Who's there?" Silence. The hum of the elevator, my own voice bouncing off the metal walls, and then a weight shifted behind me. A breath maybe, the faintest hint of perfume, floral, dry, almost metallic. I froze. It was familiar somehow, memory brushing the edges of my mind. Smell can do that more than sight sometimes. The memory of the hotel, the fire, the faces in the photographs, the ones that shouldn't exist. I tried to convince myself it was a ghost, but the word felt hollow. Ghosts were stories, this was presence. Real, calculated, patient. I stopped trying to leave the doors open. I stopped trying to shine my flashlight in the corners. Nothing showed, nothing revealed. I realized quickly that looking directly was wrong. The moment I met the empty reflection, the sensation of being watched intensified. It became routine. Enter the elevator, press the floor. Wait. The car obeys, stop at 13, someone steps in. Wait, presence, breath. I began to notice small things, changes in the car. The mirror, once clean, developed faint streaks overnight. Not fingerprints, not dust. Shadows that weren't cast by anything. Lines forming along the metal panel, edges curling slightly. A ripple across the ceiling lights, almost imperceptible, but consistent. One night I rode from the basement, deliberately pressing the first floor button. The car obeyed and I kept my eyes down, staring at the floor. Sure enough, the chime. Doors slid open. Warmth, weight, breath. I didn't look, I didn't move. I waited. The doors closed. The elevator began its ascent. I could feel them there, closer this time, not pressing, not touching, just riding. I tried to imagine who. Survivor from the fire, guest who never left, someone trapped between floors, between memory and reality. The car reached the top and I dared to glance in the mirrors. Empty, just me, pale, sweating, trembling, but the shimmer of heat along the panels betrayed the truth. Someone had been there, had been riding with me. Invisible, unrecorded, unnoticed. Each time it happened, I became smaller, quieter, more careful. Footsteps soft, hands steady, heart deliberately slow. I tried to ignore the presence, as if pretending it wasn't there would make it vanish. It didn't vanish. I began noticing changes elsewhere. The building shifted subtly, as if the hotel itself were aware of my understanding. Hallway walls stretched slightly when I passed. Carpets softened under my boots, then hardened when I paused. The chandeliers swayed without wind. The red carpet on the 13th floor seemed to pulse faintly with each step. One night I pressed the hidden button for 13 deliberately. Doors opened. I stepped inside fully. The air was warm, thick with the scent of smoke and decay. The photographs on the walls seemed closer. I could almost hear the laughter, the music, faint, distant, like echoes trapped behind glass. The weight came again, beside me, behind me, all around me, and I dared to look just for a second. Nothing but the feeling of eyes, the patient awareness. I realized then that the elevator wasn't transporting me. I was joining them. Each stop at 13 was an invitation. Each ride, a return. The building remembered every fire, every guest, every survivor who should have been counted, who should have been named, and it brought them back. I began to dread the rides, yet I could not stop. The elevator became my tether, my chain. The invisible rider or riders became familiar, patient companions. They did not speak, they did not touch, but I knew they existed. Every time the doors closed, every time the hum shifted, every time the car rose without command. I tried to keep track. Names, faces, anything I could remember. but they were always blurred, always slipping, always just beyond recognition. And yet some nights when I pressed the button and the doors opened, I could swear I saw a dress moving at the far end. Just the edge of fabric swirling lightly without wind, a brush of movement, a memory, a presence. I learned not to look, not to step too far, not to speak, only to ride, to wait, to breathe slowly. The elevator had learned its purpose, and so had I. Still riding. Every night. Every stop at 13. With them. Unseen. Uncounted. Waiting. Watching. I remember the first time I saw the motel. It was late afternoon, the sun dragging itself low across the horizon. The highway was empty, stretched out like a ribbon of asphalt that disappeared into nothing. And there it was, the Briarview Motel. Weathered wood, chipped paint, the kind of faded neon sign that buzzes once, long after the transformer has lost its mind. Vacancy, it claimed, though I knew from the stories no one ever really checked in and left again. I parked my rental car at the edge of the gravel lot. The tires crunched softly against the loose stones. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in, the kind of silence that isn't absence but expectation, like the motel itself was holding its breath. I had heard the legends first in a town diner over coffee that had gone cold, travelers who disappeared, late-night hitchhikers who vanished after passing the sign, a series of strange accidents, odd sightings, and whispers that suggested the motel was different, special, dangerous. My editor called it sensationalism, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Something in the way the waitress refused to say its name, the way she tapped the rim of her cup, eyes darting to the highway behind me. I stepped out of the car. The air was dry, carrying the scent of burned asphalt and distant sagebrush. The wind was faint, but enough to ruffle my notes in my notebook. I felt that familiar tingling along my spine, the one I'd learned to trust. This place wanted attention. I walked to the front office. The door hung slightly ajar, hinges rusted. Pushed open, it creaked in protest. Inside, dust floated in lazy shafts of sunlight that managed to sneak through grimy windows. The receptionist's desk was empty, papers scattered, old room keys strewn across the counter. A calendar from 10 years ago still hung crooked on the wall, the edges curled yellow like dead leaves. I flipped through my notebook. Names, dates, stories people had whispered. A man who vanished after stopping for gas, a couple who had booked room 7 and never checked out, a hitchhiker whose fingerprints were found on a window months after he disappeared. None of the disappearances had been solved, none explained, and here I was, staring at the very desk where travelers had last been seen. I tried the office phones. Dead, not surprising. Cell service was sketchy, disappearing entirely when I wandered behind the motel, closer to the faded cabins that lined the lot. Each cabin had a number painted on peeling wood. 1, 2, 3, up to 12. Some doors hung open slightly, as if nudged by unseen hands. I pulled out my camera, the one I brought for documentation. The lens focused on the peeling wallpaper inside the first cabin I entered. Furniture coated in dust, bedspread stiff and cracked. A faint smell of smoke lingered, though no fire had ever occurred there. I snapped pictures, careful to catch every detail, every crease, every shadow. It was then I heard it, a soft murmur almost like distant voices carried on the wind. I froze. The wind, or whatever it was, shifted. Not the sound of cars, not wildlife. Something inside moving, patient, waiting. I told myself it was the building settling. Old wood, floorboards stretching. I reminded myself I was a journalist, rational, observant, not prone to superstition. Still, I kept the camera raised. Shadows in the corners seemed darker than the dust alone should allow. A faint outline of movement flickered along the far wall. I squinted. Nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my imagination. I moved to cabin 7. The stories were strongest here. The couple who disappeared, leaving a room frozen in time. The lock hadn't been broken, the door opened easily. Inside, the room was untouched. Sheets neatly folded on the bed, a tea kettle on the small stove, its surface gleaming like it had just been polished. No dust. I froze, scanning the space. Everything else in the motel was coated in neglect, yet here pristine. Impossible. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the kettle, examined it. Cold, empty, but the sense of being watched tightened around me like a rope. The window caught my attention. Curtains slightly moved, though the air was still. Shadows outside stretched long across the lot, and then I saw the highway. Empty. Too empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for someone or something to arrive. I took notes, observed patterns, the way shadows pooled near the corners, how each room seemed to tell a story of abandonment but also presence, the presence of people who had been here long after they should have left. I walked back toward the office. The desk caught my eye again. One of the old keys had shifted. I had not touched it, couldn't have, yet it sat slightly askew as if inviting me to notice it. I picked it up, cold metal, number 7 engraved faintly. The cabin I had just left. My stomach knotted, a thrill of fear. Could be coincidence, could be wind, could be anything, but I knew better. I tried the front door, stuck, pushed harder, felt a vibration beneath my feet. The building seemed to hum softly, not a mechanical hum, not from electricity, something older, something patient, expectant. I left the office for a moment, stepping onto the porch. The sun was lower now, light fatting. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the lot, elongating the shapes of empty chairs, old signage, abandoned gas pumps. The silence pressed in, not oppressive but watchful. A bird called somewhere in the distance, or maybe it was nothing. I made my way back to the cabin row. Number 7 again. The key felt warm in my hand, though no sun had touched it. My reflection in the dusty windows showed only me, alone, but the hair on my neck prickled, a subtle pressure against the back of my skull. Someone or something was behind me. I didn't dare turn. I backed slowly, steady breaths, rational thoughts. It could be a trick of the light, the wind, an animal, anything. Yet when I reached the end of the row, the sensation didn't fade. It followed, not quickly, not aggressively, patiently, like it had all the time in the world, waiting for me to notice it, waiting for me to understand. I returned to the car, sat inside, engine off, staring at the darkening horizon. The motel stood silent, its broken neon flickering faintly, and I knew then that the legends were not exaggeration, not myths. Somewhere within that building, travelers had vanished. Their presence lingered, stitched into the walls, embedded in the floors, carried along the empty hallways. The motel remembered. It never forgot. And now so had I. I drove away slowly, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The highway stretched on, empty, endless. But the image of the motel, of that cabin, of the unseen watchers, burned in my mind. Even from miles away, I could feel it, waiting, patient, watching. I had come to document the legends, to collect evidence, to rationalize the stories. But I had only confirmed one truth. The Briarview Motel was alive in a way I could not fully understand. And I was certain I would return, because it had called me. I didn't think much of the ice machine at first. Floor 7 of the Briarview Motel was quiet, almost deliberately so. Long corridors lined with peeling wallpaper, the faint scent of mildew, and the hum of a building that seemed to remember too much. The ice machine sat in the corner by the vending area, an old beige box, unplugged for months. Dust coated its edges. Cobwebs clung to the corners. I heard it the first night just after 3 a.m., a soft, deliberate clink, like ice cubes dropping into a metal tray. My room was 2 doors down. I froze. The machine was unplugged. I knew that. I had checked it earlier. No power cord, no electricity, nothing. And yet there it was, the sound of ice falling. I leaned out into the hallway. The lights flickered faintly, just enough to make shadows pool against the walls. The sound came again. Clink, clink, clink. The cadence was slow, deliberate, almost human. I held my breath. Each drop echoed against the hallway, reverberating down to the end where the carpet darkened with age. I wanted to tell myself it was a plumbing issue. Expansion, contraction, ice shifting in a freezer somewhere below. But there was nothing below, nothing that could explain the rhythm. The building was old, yes, but not haunted by physics. I stepped toward the machine. Every footstep stretched long on the threadbare carpet. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows. Dust motes floated like tiny ghosts. I reached out to touch the machine. Cold, dry, lifeless, empty inside, not a cube to be found. The clock in the hallway struck 3:07. The sound stopped. Silence returned, but it was heavier now, expectant, waiting, like the motel was listening to me listening to it. I tried to sleep, of course, tried to rationalize. Maybe a prank from the staff. Maybe an animal nesting inside the walls. Maybe my mind frayed from the long hours documenting the abandoned motel. But each night at precisely 3:07 a.m., the sound came back. I began timing it. Calendar marks, notes in my journal. Clink, clink, clink. Always 3 drops, sometimes 4, never more, never less. Always exactly 3 minutes after 3 a.m. I started leaving my door cracked just to listen. The hallway remained still, almost unnaturally so. The machine waited in its corner, pale beige against faded wallpaper, as if counting the minutes. And then, inevitably, the sound. Ice dropping into nothing. One night I stayed by the machine, flashlight trained on it. Hand trembling slightly, I leaned close. Clink. The first cube. My flashlight caught a faint reflection inside the empty tray. Or was it a shimmer in the air? Another drop. I swore I felt a cold brush of air along my arm. The third drop. The sound echoed, vibrating through the floorboards. I stepped back. The temperature in the hallway had changed. Not cold, not warm, something viscous, pressing, patient. The dust swirled in tight spirals around the machine, though no wind stirred. I tried to touch the tray again. Nothing, just metal, empty. Then I heard a whisper, not words, not voice, just sound curling in the air, a soft exhale, almost human. Behind me, a shadow detached from the far wall. I turned slowly. Nothing. Just the long corridor, the dim lights, the peeling wallpaper. My own reflection in the emergency exit glass stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I backed toward my room. The sound stopped as I moved away. I didn't sleep. Sat in the corner with my notebook, hands shaking, heart hammering. I wrote down everything. Time, rhythm, duration, observations, sensations. It became a pattern, a ritual. Floor 7 was alive in a way I couldn't define. Not ghosts exactly, not spirits, something else. Something patient, meticulous. The ice machine was its voice, its signal, waiting for recognition, waiting for me. Some nights I tried to ignore it. I stayed in my room, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. The sound still came. A soft clink against the empty tray. I could hear it in my dreams, folding into the edges of my consciousness, pressing at the boundary between waking and sleep. The more I observed, the more I noticed other things. Footsteps in the hall that didn't belong to me. Shadows that didn't align with light. Doors opening slightly, then closing. And always at 3:07 the ice. I began keeping a recorder, placed it near the machine. Playback was revealing. The drops were never quite alone. Beneath the clinks, faint murmurs, a low resonance, almost like breathing. Not mechanical, not wind, something alive, waiting, listening. I stopped trying to explain it, started just documenting. The motel's rhythm, the ice machine's insistence. The way floor 7 seemed to stretch, to watch me, to fold in on itself. I walked past the machine one night, flashlight trained on the tray. And for a brief second I thought I saw movement inside. Not a person, not a reflection. Something shifting, waiting. I blinked. Gone. Only the empty metal tray. Only dust drifting in the faint light. And the calendar on the wall of the hallway, once crooked, once faded, had a new mark. Tiny, almost invisible, just beneath the date. 3 marks. 1 for each drop. I didn't touch it, didn't erase it, couldn't. Because I knew what it meant. The motel remembered. The ice remembered. And so did I. The rhythm continued night after night. 3:07 a.m. 3 soft drops, a cold presence brushing past, shadows curling, breaths that weren't mine. I became afraid of sleep, afraid to leave the corridor, afraid to turn my back on the ice machine, afraid of what or who might be stepping inside each drop, patient, invisible, uncounted. I began speaking to it, whispered at it. Notes in my journal, observations, questions. Answers never came, only the rhythm, the presence, the waiting. I left floor 7 once, only briefly, returned. The ice machine was there waiting, patient, insistent. The motel was not empty, not ever, not for a moment, not even for the nights when no human dared to walk the halls. And the ice falling in silence reminded me of that. At 3:07 a.m. every night the sound of ice echoed through the hallways. A single, simple voice, clear, insistent, unmistakable. And I always listened. Because if I didn't, I knew it would stop, but the watching would not. I never thought a room could disappear. Not physically, of course. Walls don't vanish on their own. But I began to understand that the Briarview Motel had its own rules, its own architecture, and that some of its spaces existed only for reasons I wasn't meant to comprehend. It started with the security photos. I had spent the day in the office going through old tapes. Well, not tapes, really digital backups from the motel's defunct surveillance system. Nothing particularly interesting at first. Empty hallways, dust drifting in sunlight through cracked windows, a few raccoons that had wandered in one summer. And then I found it, room 13. I froze the frame, looked closer. The hallway was familiar, same peeling wallpaper, same faded red carpet, but the door was new. Or at least it hadn't existed yesterday when I walked that corridor. The number was carved in brass, polished, gleaming in the grainy surveillance footage. Room 13. I stepped back, heart hammering. I remembered the corridor, counted the doors again. 12. Only 12 doors. My notebook confirmed it. Every door accounted for. There was no 13th. And yet there it was. I went to the corridor. Slowly, deliberately, footsteps soft, breath shallow. The hallway stretched long, shadows pooling in familiar corners. I counted the doors again. 1 through 12. Nothing beyond, nothing new. I turned, almost certain I'd imagined it. The air was cooler here. The lights overhead flickered faintly. I could feel the motel watching. The building had always had a rhythm, a pulse beneath the floors, beneath the walls. And now it throbbed differently, uneasy, expectant. I returned to the office, scanning the surveillance frames frame by frame. Every night over the past month, room 13 appeared. Every time exactly the same. Doors closed, no movement, no record of guests. Yet the camera caught it, perfectly framed, as if it had always existed in another dimension of the building. I started to notice details. Shadows that didn't align with light. Carpets that shifted subtly in the corners of the frame. A slight distortion along the edges, like the camera was recording something not meant to be captured. Something patient, deliberate, waiting. I wanted to call it a glitch, a corrupted file. I wanted to believe the motel was nothing more than decaying wood and bad wiring, but my gut refused comfort. I had spent nights walking those hallways, watching, listening. The air had a weight here, a patient pressure that the old building alone could not produce. I checked the room numbers on the hallway again, 1 through 12, each door accounted for. The odd numbering made sense in the old blueprints. Room 13 had been intentionally skipped, the superstition built into the walls themselves. And yet, in the footage, there it was, a brass plaque gleaming in a corridor that technically should not exist. I became obsessed. I wandered the halls, flashlight raised, waiting, pressed my ear to the door frames, listened for the faintest creak of movement. Nothing that I could hear. Yet sometimes I felt it, a presence in the wood, a shift in the air, as if the motel itself were holding its breath, showing me the impossible. The longer I observed, the more I understood. Room 13 had never been meant to exist for me. It existed for others, long gone, long missing. Guests who had vanished, travelers who had stopped here and never left. The room was a record, a monument, a space preserved only in the edges of memory and the lenses of cameras. I started leaving my recorder running near the corridor. Microphone placed at the junction of the wall and ceiling, capturing the faintest hums, whispers, creaks. Sometimes I played it back and thought I heard faint voices. Not words, not language, just sound curling in the air, like breathing, like waiting. One night I swore I saw movement, a flicker in the corner of my eye as I approached where the door should have been. A shadow not cast by anything I could identify. I blinked. Gone. Only the hallway, only the 12 doors, only the familiar carpet. I touched the walls, smooth where they should have been rough, cold where they should have held the heat of the day. I stepped back. My flashlight beam trembled, catching only dust motes. The weight of eyes pressed at my back, though no one was there. I went home that night, exhausted, heart racing. Dreams followed me. I walked corridors that stretched impossibly. Doors appeared and vanished. Shadows lingered just beyond the edges of vision. Always the number 13, brass and gleaming, always the impossibility of it. I returned the next day. Surveillance footage had not changed. Room 13 remained, always present, always absent, always watching. I tried to document it methodically. Notes, measurements, photos, nothing could capture the truth of it. The building had rules, I had broken them. I had seen what it wanted me to see, and now it expected me to understand. The motel did not sleep. The walls did not rest. And room 13 was proof. A space that had never been built, never intended to exist, preserved by memory, by presence, by the impossible architecture of disappearance. Every night I lingered, I could feel it. A pulse in the hallway, a warmth behind walls that should have been cold, dust drifting in slow spirals where air currents could not reach. The room was waiting, patient, intentional. And I realized that the motel did not want me to leave. It wanted witnesses, not participants, not victims, at least not yet, but witnesses, observers of the impossible, the spaces that never should have existed. I became careful, footsteps soft, hands steady, breathing deliberate. The hallway stretched endlessly, but the edges shimmered now, as if the building itself was bending to accommodate the impossible. I left my recorder running again. Night after night, the faintest trace of movement, a shift in shadows, a sound of something sliding lightly against the floor, and always in my mind the gleam of brass. Room 13. It was never meant for me, but it had chosen to exist anyway. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't leave it unobserved, because once you see what should not exist, you cannot unsee it. And I understood slowly, painfully, that room 13 would never stop existing. Not for me, not for anyone. It was waiting. It was patient. And it would remember. Always. Even when the motel itself forgot. Even when the cameras failed. Even when the highway was empty and the world carried on, ignorant of the space that had never been built. I returned each night to witness it, to listen for it, to document the impossible. The brass plaque, the gleaming number, the weight of absence made real. And I knew, finally, that some rooms are not meant to be entered. Some rooms are meant only to wait. To exist in shadows, in surveillance, in memory, and in fear. Room 13. The missing room. And now mine. Always. The first time I set foot inside the Marlowe resort, it felt like walking into a memory that didn't belong to me. The lobby stretched wide and empty, sunlight slipping in through dust-streaked windows. The scent of saltwater hung faintly in the air, mingled with mildew and the faint decay of paint peeling from walls. I had been hired to clean, nothing more. But already I could feel that the building had other ideas. The front desk was silent, its polished wood dulled by months of neglect. Room keys lay scattered across its surface, like tiny artifacts of lives that had come and gone. I ran my hand over the desk, noting the scratches, the dents, the history embedded in every groove. It was too quiet. The ocean outside rolled gently, waves breaking on the distant rocks, but inside the air felt thick, heavy, expectant. I wheeled my cart down the corridor toward the first guest rooms. Floorboards groaned softly underfoot, a slow, measured creaking that seemed to follow me as I walked. Each door I passed was closed, some hanging slightly off their hinges, others sealed shut with stubborn locks. The faded numbers above them, painted years ago, looked like they had been pressed into the walls with the weight of time itself. I reached room 12. The door resisted my hand but finally gave way. The carpet inside was stiff and matted. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of light that fell from the high windows. I unpacked my supplies, starting with the bathroom, wiping years of grime from porcelain sinks and tiled walls. The water had been shut off for months, so I worked with damp cloths and spray bottles, the scent of cleaner mixing strangely with the salty air that crept in from outside. As I moved through the room, I thought I heard a soft creak from the hall. Footsteps, perhaps. I paused. The air seemed to settle around me, pressing lightly against my skin. I told myself it was the building itself, old wood shifting in the afternoon heat. But my heart rate sped up despite my rational mind. I finished room 12 and moved to room 11. Each space told its own story. A torn curtain here, a broken lamp there, remnants of guests who had left long before. I imagined them walking through the halls, laughing, arguing, sleeping. I imagined the waves crashing outside while they slept inside. And I felt in some quiet corner of my mind the faint brush of eyes on me, though no one was there. By the time I reached the main ballroom, the sun had dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the floor, pooling near the stage and under the rows of chairs stacked neatly in the corner. Dust motes swirled in the faint breeze that came from cracked windows. I had brought a vacuum for the carpet, but it sounded too loud in the cavernous space. So I swept instead, slow strokes that scraped at the decades of neglect. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A fleeting shadow, nothing more than a trick of the light or perhaps my imagination. I paused, held my breath. The ballroom was still, the silence profound. Even the ocean outside seemed muted, the waves a distant whisper. I started cleaning the hallway again, mopping the floor near the lobby. Each pass of the mop left streaks of water that glimmered faintly in the fading light. The air smelled sharper now, cleaner but somehow heavier. I heard another sound, a faint tap like a finger drumming lightly against wood. I froze, listening. Only the sound of the ocean, only the distant cry of gulls. By the time night came, I had made my way to the upper floors. The stairwell was narrow, dark, the paint peeling like old skin. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating faded numbers and scuffed walls. The elevator was out of service, so the stairs were my only path. I felt the shift in temperature as I climbed, cooler air, heavier, almost moist. My breath misted faintly in front of me, though the night was mild outside. I checked the guest rooms systematically, dusting, wiping, sweeping. Each room was silent, yet not entirely empty. The bedsheets rustled slightly, though no wind blew through the hallways. Doors creaked when I passed, soft hinges complaining, or so I told myself. But the feeling persisted, the impression that the rooms themselves remembered, that the past guests lingered in some residual form, tracing the steps of their lives across the floorboards and walls. In room 7, I found a small photograph under the dresser. Black and white, faded. A family standing on the beach in front of the resort. Smiling for the camera, their eyes seemed almost alive. I placed the photo gently on the desk, trying not to shake. How long had it been here, hidden in dust and darkness? I couldn't imagine. As midnight approached, the building seemed to breathe. I heard it in the sigh of the walls, the creak of floorboards, the distant slap of waves. It was not threatening, not yet, but it was aware. It was watching, patient and deliberate. I finished the final hallway, stacking chairs in the small lounge near the lobby. The overhead lights flickered, threatening to die completely. I paused, listening. Silence again, heavy and complete. But I could still feel the weight of the past in the air, lingering in corners, clinging to surfaces I had touched. I set my cleaning supplies down and sat in the lobby chair, exhausted. My eyes traced the outline of the front desk, the shadowed corridors, the dim glow of the moon outside the windows. I could feel the history of the place pressing in, pressing me to notice it, to understand it. I thought of the guests who had come and gone, of the families who had laughed and cried here, of the ones who had disappeared quietly into the night, leaving rooms frozen in time. I could feel them in the air, faint as a sigh, soft as a breath, present as the dust motes that danced in the flashlight beams. I realized then that cleaning was not simply a task. It was a ritual, an acknowledgement, a way to mark my presence in a place that had long been abandoned but not forgotten. Every sweep of the mop, every dusted surface, every careful adjustment of a chair or lamp was an offering of attention. And I understood something else. The hotel did not want noise. It did not want intrusion, but it did want recognition. To acknowledge the weight of what had been lived here, what had been lost. It wanted me to remember, even if I did not yet know what. I stayed in the lobby for a while longer, letting the silence settle around me. The moonlight softened the edges of the furniture, shadows lengthened, and I could hear the ocean murmuring in the distance. A presence, maybe, a memory. I did not know, but it was there, and I was aware. By the time I finally left, dragging my supplies behind me, the resort felt less empty, though emptiness still clung to its corners. I had done my work, yes, but the place had done something to me in return. It had reminded me that even in silence, even in abandonment, there are stories waiting, waiting for recognition, waiting for someone to notice. And I knew I would return, because the Marlowe Resort was never truly empty. And neither was I. I first noticed the cart late one night, around 2 a.m., while walking the dim hallway on the second floor of the Marlowe Resort. My flashlight beam caught its edge before I realized it wasn't supposed to be there. A housekeeping cart, polished chrome glinting faintly in the weak emergency lights, loaded with neatly folded towels and bottles of cleaning solution. I froze. The resort hadn't had staff for years. The contract I worked under was strictly for preparing the building for auction. No one lived here. No one cleaned here. And yet there it was, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for me. I stepped closer. My shoes made soft squeaks on the worn linoleum, and the cart didn't move. Not a single wheel shifted, no sound of metal brushing carpet. I circled it once, running my hand along the side, cautious. It was heavy, real, tangible. Towels smelled faintly of bleach, the scent sharp and clean against the dusty air of the hallway. I backed away slowly, convinced I must be dreaming. Perhaps I had dozed in one of the rooms, and this was some hallucination brought on by fatigue. But my journal rested on my shoulder strap, still dry, my flashlight still in hand. Nothing should have created this. The cart disappeared the next morning, just as silently as it had appeared. I returned later to inspect the hallway. Nothing. No wheels, indentation in the carpet, no scent of bleach lingering. Only the faint memory of weight pressing against my palm. The following night, I walked the same route, flashlight scanning the doors, counting them absent-mindedly. Room 207-208-209, and there, outside room 210, exactly where it had not been the night before, the cart waited again. Towels folded neatly, a fresh bottle of cleaner balanced on the top shelf. I couldn't hear wheels, I couldn't hear movement, but I could feel it. A presence, patient, watching. I followed it, not closely, not daring to touch, just enough to keep it in my vision. It did not move, and yet when I turned a corner to another hallway, I found it waiting there too, perfectly positioned outside another room. I could not explain it, could not understand it. There were no tracks, no scuff marks, no logical explanation. I started documenting it. Time, location, arrangement of items, every night. 2 a.m. first appearance. 3 rooms later gone by morning. The pattern was consistent. A quiet ritual performed by something, someone, the building itself. The hallway smelled different each night, faintly of bleach and wax, though I never saw the cart move, never saw the door open, never saw footsteps accompanying it. And yet, the scent persisted, lingering just enough to know someone or something had been there. I tried to speak to it once, whispered my name softly as I walked past. The air shifted. Not a breeze, not wind from broken windows, just a subtle press against my cheek, a tiny vibration in the floor beneath my boots. The cart didn't react, didn't move, but I knew it had noticed. Some nights I stayed in the hallway longer, leaning against the wall, listening. The emergency lights flickered low, shadows pooling and stretching across the carpet. I could hear the faintest hum, almost imperceptible, like metal brushing metal, or perhaps a wheel shifting slightly, but when I looked, nothing moved. Nothing at all. I wondered about the staff who had worked here long ago. Perhaps their routines persisted, embedded in the wood and plaster, preserved like some stubborn memory. The building held them like photographs, carefully curated in hallways and rooms. The cart was a manifestation of that memory. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that had learned what cleaning meant and mimicked it. I became afraid to ignore it. If I stepped into the elevator, tried to ascend to the upper floors too quickly, I would find it waiting when I returned. Outside, another room. Silent, still, polished chrome and folded towels glinting under the dim light. I could never approach it directly, not when the shadows pooled at the edges of the hall. The more I observed, the more aware I became of other anomalies. Faint scuff marks where none should exist, dust disturbed in impossible patterns, hints of someone moving behind walls just beyond my perception. Always the cart, always the soundless approach of its wheels, or the suggestion of wheels, always the faint scent of bleach, always the subtle weight of attention pressing on me. I stopped leaving the doors open after cleaning. I would close each room and step back into the hallway, watching, waiting, and inevitably the cart would appear, quietly outside one of the doors I had just finished. It was patient, deliberate, knowing I would see it. I tried to tell myself it was the building's quirks, the settling of old materials, the echoes of memory manifesting. But the pattern was too precise, too consistent, too deliberate. Someone or something moved it. Not quickly, not aggressively, quietly, patiently, methodically. I began whispering to it softly night after night. My name, the hours, simple words, nothing, no response. Yet the hallway felt different, tighter somehow, more aware. I could feel it tracking me, nodding my presence, waiting for recognition, for acknowledgement, for observation. One night I heard it before I saw it. The softest scrape of metal against the linoleum, almost imperceptible. My flashlight caught it, 12 feet down the hall, slightly closer to me than it had been a moment ago. I froze. The cart was moving, not with wheels, not with force, but as if the floor itself carried it, shifting quietly along the grain of the boards. I blinked, it stopped. Not a sound, not a wheel, not a single sign that it had moved. Only position, subtly changed, demanding notice. I realized then the cart wasn't just an object. It was a presence, a witness, a messenger, the building's own way of reminding me that I was never truly alone here, that the history of this place lingered, preserved in chrome, in towels, in faint scents of bleach and water. I began documenting my observations in detail. Room number, floor, arrangement, time of appearance, and always, noting the absence of explanation. The cart existed in a loop I could not break, a quiet ritual I could not disrupt, a patient entity performing tasks that were no longer required, for reasons I would never fully understand. And yet I watched, every night, patiently, because to ignore it felt like more than negligence. It felt like disrespect. The resort had survived storms, neglect, abandonment, and still it moved in its small, inexplicable ways. The cart was the voice of all of that history, of all of the things unseen, of all of the memories that clung to the corners of walls and floors. By the end of my second week, I could predict it. 2 a.m. always, appearing outside a freshly cleaned room, remaining perfectly still, silent, waiting, and then slowly, imperceptibly moving, always returning, always present, always watching. I became part of its rhythm, the cart and I, a duet across the hallways of the abandoned resort. I swept, I wiped, I documented, and it responded, not with motion, not with sound, but with presence. A presence that was patient, deliberate, and infinitely aware. I understood, finally, that the Marlowe resort was alive in ways no one could see. The cart was its whisper, a gesture of memory, of routine preserved long past its usefulness. It was a reminder that even in absence there is presence. Even in abandonment there is attention. And so I continued, every night, watching, documenting, acknowledging, respecting the rhythm of a place that had long ceased to employ staff, yet moved as if it had never stopped. Because the cart would return, every night, and I would be there, waiting, listening, watching, aware of the impossible persistence of a building that remembered. I should have stopped noticing it. I should have let the carts, the hallways, the shadows, simply exist and pass them off as tricks of old wood, of dust, of fatigue. But the Marlowe resort had its own persistence, and by the third week of my cleaning contract, it began offering subtler signs, insistent, deliberate, impossible. It started with the towels, fresh towels, folded perfectly, stacked neatly on beds that were locked. Rooms I had no key for, rooms sealed months ago to prevent accidents or intrusion. Yet every morning, after I had finished my nightly rounds and left, I would return to find them. Crisp, white, heavy cotton towels folded exactly the way the housekeeping staff had folded them before the hotel closed in 2008. I remembered seeing those folds in old photographs of the cleaning routines. Corners sharply pressed, edges aligned precisely, the towels almost ceremoniously presented. I first noticed it outside room 312. The door was locked, the key long since removed from the board. I brushed my hand over the knob to confirm, half expecting the lock to have failed. It was secure. No tampering, no signs of entry. And yet when I opened the door with my master key, the one I had been given for maintenance purposes, there they were. 3 towels stacked on the bed, folded like origami, immaculate in their impossible order. I backed out of the room slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I went to the other rooms I had cleaned the night before. No towels, nothing new, just dust, shadows, the faint scent of bleach that clung to the corridors. I left the floor, telling myself it was coincidence. Perhaps someone else had accessed the room, though who had permission, who could move through these halls in the dead of night without me hearing them. The next night I returned to room 312, flashlight scanning the hallway carefully. The cart from the previous chapter waited outside room 310, stationary, glinting in the dim lights. I ignored it as best I could, focusing on my work. I completed my cleaning rounds, shutting each room carefully behind me. When I returned to room 312, I found 4 towels stacked neatly on the bed, one more than the night before. I counted, checked the folds, smelled the fabric lightly, clean, fresh, unmistakably folded. I began documenting them. Time, room number, arrangement, number of towels, exact folds. The pattern grew over the next week. Rooms that had never been accessed by anyone since the closure produced towels on a strict schedule. Always after my cleaning rounds, always placed in precise formation. I thought about the homicide case from 2008, the case that had made headlines, that had turned the Marlowe resort into a place of quiet dread. A guest had been killed in room 312. The details were murky. A dispute, a sudden rage, a single act that ended a life in the room I now cleaned nightly. The room had been sealed afterward, investigated, documented. Nothing had been disturbed in the years since. And yet here I was, staring at the folded towels, knowing exactly how the housekeeping staff had arranged them years ago, and knowing I had done nothing to put them there. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps a maintenance worker with a master key, though no one had been contracted at night. Perhaps a prank. Perhaps even a residual hallucination, though I could smell the bleach on the fabric, feel the weight of the cotton in my hands. It was real, undeniably real. The following nights, the pattern intensified. Towels appeared in room 210, room 214, room 319. The more I documented, the more precise the arrangements became. Sometimes the folds matched old photographs I had found in the archives. Sometimes they differed slightly, subtle variations I could not explain, yet always intentional, deliberate, always meticulous. I began sleeping less. My dreams were filled with corridors, folded towels stacked in impossible patterns, the faint hum of fluorescent lights that never stayed lit for more than a few seconds. I would wake and feel a weight in my chest, the silent observation of the hotel pressing against me. The towels, once a simple impossibility, had become a language, a communication, a reminder that the resort was aware, attentive, patient. One night I heard it, a faint rustling, soft and deliberate like fabric sliding across a bed. I had just cleaned room 214 and moved on to the hallway outside room 216. The sound came from 214, soft, measured. I froze. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the closed door. Nothing moved. No wind. No animal. Just the faintest sound of fabric brushing against itself. I opened the door slowly. 3 towels lay on the bed, folded as always. I stepped closer, noticing that one towel had been arranged slightly differently than the last night. The edges tucked at a sharper angle, corners aligned in a way I had never seen before. I reached out to adjust it, and the room seemed to exhale. A shift in the air, subtle, perceptible. The temperature dropped slightly. I withdrew my hand, feeling watched, feeling the presence of whatever lingered here long before me. I began to anticipate the pattern. 2 a.m. was consistent. The folded towels would appear within 30 minutes of my cleaning rounds ending. Room 312, room 214, room 210, room 319, always in sequence, though the order changed slightly from night to night. I tried to follow it to catch the process in action, but the rooms remained locked until I entered them. No footprints, no evidence, no sign that any human or anything had been there. I started whispering to the towels. Silly, perhaps, but I needed acknowledgement. I would speak softly to them as I placed my own folded towels in the other rooms. "I see you," I would murmur. "I notice." The air would shift in response, the faintest sigh of wind through cracks in the windows. And when I returned later, the towels would be folded in more precise, deliberate formations. I thought of the guest who had been killed in room 312. The room had become a locus, a focus of attention. Perhaps the towels were an echo of the care that had once existed here, the ritual of housekeeping preserved beyond reason, beyond death. Or perhaps it was something more insistent, something alive, patient, waiting for recognition. The pattern was too perfect, too deliberate, too aware. And yet I was drawn in, compelled to continue, compelled to observe, to document, to acknowledge. Every towel became a marker, a signal. Every fold, every crease, a reminder that the Marlowe resort was not empty, that it remembered, that it cared, or at least it noticed. By the end of the week, I had lost count of nights spent tracking the folded towels. They had become my companions, my markers, my silent observers. I had come to anticipate them, to move carefully through the hallways, to speak softly to the rooms, to respect the silent rhythm of the building. The Marlowe resort communicated not with voices, not with footsteps, not with sound. It communicated with folded towels. And I listened, because I understood in a way that terrified me that the folded towels were not a joke. They were not coincidence. They were a presence, deliberate, patient, meticulous, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for recognition, waiting for me to notice, to see, to understand. I stayed in the hallway outside room 312 one night, long after my rounds were done. The emergency lights flickered low, casting elongated shadows across the carpet. I could hear the faint hum of the building settling, the whisper of old air ducts, the occasional creak of floorboards. And there, on the bed, 3 folded towels waited. I whispered my acknowledgement softly, deliberately. I see you all. And in that moment I felt a quiet shift, subtle but profound. A presence, patient, deliberate, aware. The Marlowe Resort had recognized me, not as an intruder, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood the rituals, the echoes, the silent history embedded in these hallways. I left the room carefully, closing the door behind me. The folded towels remained, untouched, perfect, waiting for the next observer. And I knew I would return, because the Marlowe Resort never stops noticing. And neither should I. I had begun to feel like the Marlowe Resort was breathing around me. The folded towels, the carts that moved silently, the faint hum of a building that should have been dead, these were not coincidences. I understood that, but nothing prepared me for what I found that night. It started in the records room. I had been going through old personnel files, inventory lists, and incident reports, anything that could shed light on the history of the resort, its sudden abandonment, and the rumors that clung to it like mildew. The documents were yellowed, brittle, stamped with dates I barely remembered. And then I saw her name. Mabel Jennings, housekeeping staff, employed until the week of the homicide in room 312. According to the records, she was scheduled to do rounds on the night of the investigation sheets, dusting, checking in on rooms that had been vacated. But she never finished her shift. The files listed her as missing, vanished, never found. I should have paused there, stepped back, called someone. But the instinct that had drawn me into this place, curiosity, stubbornness, a quiet terror I couldn't shake, pushed me forward. I read everything about her, schedules, assignments, notes from supervisors. Each page was filled with reminders. Check the linens, fold towels precisely, disinfect the counters, ensure all rooms were locked before midnight. And then after that, nothing. No explanation. Just the absence of Mabel Jennings. The hallway outside room 312 felt different that night. Colder, though the air conditioning was off. The emergency lights flickered faintly. I carried my flashlight, shining it across the hall, across the floorboards that creaked underfoot. And then I noticed it. A faint scent of soap, lavender and bleach combined, trailing from the room down the corridor. I stopped. That scent, I had smelled it before. It wasn't from me. Not from the cleaning supplies I had used. It was precise, deliberate, and impossibly familiar. Mabel's scent. I didn't know her personally, but the records, the old photographs, the uniforms, this was her presence, tangible, lingering. I entered room 312 slowly. The bed was made, towels folded. The desk drawers were aligned neatly, pencils sharpened, small notes placed in perfect order. My pulse quickened. I realized what I was seeing. She had never stopped. The rounds she had been assigned decades ago, the rituals she performed each night had continued. Somehow, unbroken. I whispered her name. Mabel. The word felt absurd in the silence, ridiculous almost, but I needed acknowledgement. The room responded. Not audibly, not violently, not with movement, but with presence. The air shifted, subtle, like a breath over the back of my neck. I felt observed, measured, and noted. I moved to the closet. Jackets hung neatly. Shoes lined the floor, pairs perfectly arranged. I reached toward a shoe and froze. My hand felt a resistance, the faintest brush of warmth against my fingertips, as though she had been there moments before. I spun around. Nothing. Shadows played against the walls. The overhead light flickered. I began following the trail, if it could be called that. The scent lingered, leading me from room 312 to room 314, then to 310. Each room showed signs of meticulous care. Towels folded, counters wiped, beds arranged with a precision I could never match, and always the faint scent lingering in corners, trailing the walls. I wondered if she had been trapped in some loop, some echo of duty that outlasted the living. Perhaps the investigation, the chaos of that night, had tethered her spirit, her consciousness, to these tasks. Perhaps the building had absorbed her dedication and continued it in the decades since. I began whispering softly to her. "It's okay. I see you, I understand. The air shifted again, warmer this time, the faintest sigh brushing my cheek. I imagined her presence, meticulous, watchful, deliberate, almost maternal in the way she aligned towels and straightened sheets. The weight of her observation pressed gently, reminding me I was intruding in her domain. Night after night, I followed her rounds or the echo of them. I could anticipate where she would be. Room 312 first always. Room 314 next, then 310. I moved with her, not daring to rush, not daring to interrupt. I noted patterns, the folds of towels, the direction of the creases, the precise angle of bed corners. Each movement, each arrangement, an unspoken message. One night I heard something unmistakable, the faintest shuffle of cloth, almost like someone walking barefoot across carpet. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound moved from the end of the hall to room 312, then vanished. I didn't dare move for several minutes, letting my ears strain for the next indication. Then a whisper, not my voice, not audible, but somehow present. I felt it in the air, brushing against my thoughts, guiding me, observing me. I realized I was no longer alone in the resort. I was never alone. Mabel's presence, persistent, careful, patient, was here, moving through the hallways, completing tasks I had not assigned her. The building had not abandoned her. The murder, the investigation, the decades of silence, they had not freed her. She continued, quietly, relentlessly. I began leaving notes, small scraps of paper with simple acknowledgments. I see you. Thank you. I understand. I placed them on the bed she had made, tucked beneath the folded towels. Each morning they would remain untouched, sometimes slightly repositioned. I knew she had seen them. I knew she had recognized my attempts to connect. And then it happened. I was in room 314, adjusting the placement of towels on the bed. I felt it, a breath on the back of my neck. Cold, deliberate, patient. I turned slowly. Nothing, no shadow, no figure. But a single towel previously stacked on the top shelf of the cart was now folded perfectly on the bed, a new crease sharper than before. I understood then. She was aware. She was guiding me, testing me, observing my acknowledgement. I stopped trying to rationalize. Logic failed here. Reason faltered. Time was fractured and the building existed in a loop of memory, duty, and persistence. Mabel Jennings was not missing. She was present, completing her rounds, ensuring the rooms remained ordered, the linens folded, the towels stacked, patiently, relentlessly, eternally. I began to notice small signs beyond the rooms, footprints in dustless hallways that appeared and vanished, the faint hum of activity in rooms I had not entered, shadows brushing just beyond the corners of vision, and always the folded towels, the aligned beds, the scent of bleach and lavender lingering in the corridors. I spoke to her nightly, whispered, sometimes asking questions, sometimes acknowledging her work. I see your rounds. I notice your care. The air would shift in response, subtle, deliberate, like a hand brushing through my thoughts. And when I returned the next evening, the rooms reflected her acknowledgement, small changes in folds, subtle adjustments that indicated awareness. The Marlowe resort had given me a companion, a presence older than the decades of abandonment, rooted in ritual, meticulousness, and unbroken duty. Mabel Jennings was no longer simply a ghost or a memory. She was a sentinel, and I was part of her nightly observation. By the end of my month-long contract, I no longer feared her presence. I respected it. I moved carefully, followed the pattern of her rounds, documented the folded towels, the aligned beds, the precise arrangements. I understood finally that the hotel had not forgotten her, and neither had I, because she was still here, still moving, still folding, still watching. And I would not stop noticing. I never thought I'd own a hotel, not in the usual sense anyway, not the bustling, grand kind with shining brass fixtures and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the lobby. The kind that fills postcards and promises adventure. No, what I inherited from Uncle Howard was something else entirely. A roadside hotel, long past its prime. Tucked into the edge of a town I barely remembered from childhood, worn and sagging, like the final note of a song you only half remember. The letter came first. Crisp typed, the envelope smelling faintly of tobacco. Uncle Howard had passed away alone in the very hotel he'd run for decades. Cause of death. Official reports were vague, heart failure, they said, but there was a silence in those papers that spoke louder than any cause could. No family, no visitors, just the building, staring blankly over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, its windows dark and empty. And now it was mine. I drove through the town that evening, the sun falling behind distant hills, spilling long shadows across the road. The hotel sat at the intersection of nowhere and forgotten, its neon sign half-lit, flickering welcome in uneven letters. Paint peeled from the walls and the roof sagged, shingles missing like missing teeth. The parking lot was cracked, weeds crawling up through fissures. And yet I felt it before I even pulled in. A weight, a pull. As if the building itself recognized me, even though I hadn't been here in years. I parked my car, the engine ticking down. I stepped out and let my eyes roam over the facade. The front door was wooden, scuffed, with a brass handle dulled by decades of hands that may have never been mine to count. I hesitated, the wind brushing my face, carrying the faint scent of mildew and dust. I knew the hotel was empty. It had been struggling for years. No guests, no staff, barely enough income to cover the occasional electricity bill, according to the reports I had read. Yet as I lifted my hand to the door, I felt a quiet awareness pressing down, a weight that whispered in the spaces between the creaks of the weathered wood. Inside, the lobby was dim. Sunlight filtered weakly through dirty windows, casting a pall over threadbare carpets and the chipped reception desk. Papers were scattered everywhere, ledgers, invoices, maintenance notes from decades ago. I walked slowly, each footstep soft against the worn floorboards. The air was heavy, carrying an almost tangible memory. It was the smell of bleach, of old coffee, of late-night cigarette smoke, the ghosts of ordinary life, preserved and waiting. I ran my hand along the front desk, brushing over the keys and faded notes. There was a ledger open on the counter, yellowed pages filled with names, dates, and room numbers. I flipped it gently, careful not to tear the brittle paper. I could see the decline, gaps between guests, longer stays unfilled, nights without bookings. The handwriting varied, some pages neat, others hurried, anxious. I could feel the rhythm of the hotel's life pulse faintly beneath the dust. It had been alive once, and perhaps it still remembered. I made my way down the corridor to the rooms. Each door was closed, some locked, some ajar. The hallway smelled faintly of wood polish and mildew, a mix that reminded me of childhood summers in my uncle's care. But the air carried something else too, the quiet expectation of being watched. I tried to laugh it off, muttering to myself, telling myself it was the building settling, the wind through broken windows. But the silence was deliberate. It pressed against my ears as if listening. I reached room 214 and paused. My uncle's favorite room, according to the sparse records I had found. The door was locked, the key long since missing. I pressed my ear against it, hearing nothing but the dull hum of the electrical lines still running, faint, reliable, unbroken. It was strange, considering the hotel's state. The wiring had been maintained even as the rest of the building decayed. The light in the hall flickered weakly as if acknowledging my presence. The first night I stayed in the hotel, I slept in room 212. I could hear it then, the faintest shuffle in the hallway, soft against the carpet. I told myself it was mice, the old building's wood contracting, the wind rattling the windows. But as I lay awake, listening, I became aware of small sounds. The gentle click of a door hinge somewhere down the hall, the soft brush of something moving against the carpet, almost imperceptible. I told myself it was nothing, that hotels, especially old ones, made noises, that it was only the mind playing tricks, anticipating the worst. But the next morning I found something I could not explain. A single envelope resting on the reception desk, my name on it written in my uncle's handwriting. Inside, a note, "Pay attention. It is still here. The hotel remembers." I froze. My heart hammered, but I laughed nervously, thinking it must have been left by the previous caretaker, someone who had known I was coming. Yet the envelope was sealed in wax, old and cracked, and the handwriting matched letters I had received from my uncle years before. No one else could have written it. I spent the next few days walking the hallways, inspecting every room. Nothing out of place, and yet the feeling of being observed grew heavier. I would enter a room, check the sheets, the bathroom, the carpets, and leave, only to feel that quiet weight pressing just behind me as I moved down the hall. The hotel did not creak at random. The doors did not open without reason. It was alive and it was aware. Sometimes in the dim light of evening, I would see movement out of the corner of my eye. Curtains fluttering without wind, shadows brushing the hallway walls. I would turn sharply, flashlight cutting through the darkness, and find nothing. But the air remained tense, almost expectant, like the hotel was waiting for me to see, to acknowledge its presence. I began keeping notes. Each sound, each flicker of movement, each whisper of the old carpets underfoot. I documented patterns, times, locations, the hum of the lights. There were rhythms to the building, subtle and precise, as if it moved according to its own logic, independent of me. At night when I lay in bed, I would hear the faintest echoes, a chair scraping across the floor, a door clicking softly, footsteps that were deliberate, not haphazard. I tried to sleep through them, telling myself it was the building settling, the wind, the mind. But the sounds had intention. I could feel it in the quiet pauses, in the stretches of silence between the noises. And then I understood something I could not ignore. The hotel was waiting for me to notice. It had been waiting decades for someone who belonged, or at least someone who could recognize it. My uncle had left it to me, but not because he wanted me to run it. He had left it to me because he knew I would see it. The hotel, even in decay, still had life, and it still had memory. The first night I stayed alone, I thought I was simply in a building. By the second night, I realized I was sharing it with something older, persistent, and patient. The roadside hotel was not empty. It had always been aware of its guests, its staff, its routines. Even in the years after my uncle's death, even through neglect and decay, it retained the echoes of life. I could feel them now. The weight of the hallways, the vigilance of the rooms, the lingering scent of polish, soap, and tobacco. The hotel remembered every guest, every housekeeper, every small action that had taken place within its walls. It remembered my uncle, and now it remembered me. I could not leave, not yet. There were questions, observations, patterns I had not yet deciphered. The hotel had inherited me as much as I had inherited it. It demanded acknowledgement. It demanded attention. And I, whether I liked it or not, had agreed to pay it. Because some legacies are not written in paper or deeds. Some are written in memory, in presence, in the subtle insistence of a place that refuses to be forgotten. And the Marlowe or Howard's roadside hotel, as the faded sign now suggested, was insistent. I had arrived, and it had begun to speak. I had spent the first day walking the halls, familiarizing myself with the Marlowe, our roadside hotel, its faded sign and sagging roof now strangely personal. It was only when the sun had dipped low behind the hills that I remembered the basement. Uncle Howard had mentioned it once in passing during a rare phone call years ago. He said it was where the real work happens. At the time, I'd assumed it was nothing more than storage or an old maintenance room. I was wrong. The stairs to the basement were tucked behind a service door, hidden at the end of the hallway near the kitchen. The metal handle was cold beneath my fingers, the hinges stiff with disuse. I hesitated. There was something about the shadow that seemed to gather there, pooling at the base of the steps, but I had to know. I had to see. The basement smelled like dust, damp wood, and something older I couldn't name. My flashlight cut across rows of shelves, boxes stacked unevenly, and filing cabinets dented with age. But it wasn't until I found the office door that I realized what my uncle had meant. The small wooden door looked ordinary, almost apologetic, but the brass plate, engraved simply with office, hid something extraordinary and something terribly private. Inside, the room was cramped. Wires snaked along the walls like roots, leading to banks of small monitors, tape recorders, and stacks of notebooks. My stomach tightened. This was no ordinary office. It had been built for observation, for watching, recording, cataloging. Each monitor displayed old footage security cameras that I hadn't seen anywhere else in the hotel. Each reel, each tape, meticulously labeled with dates going back decades. I approached the nearest desk. A reel-to-reel recorder hummed faintly as if it had been waiting. I lifted one tape and read the label, Room 214, July 1978. My uncle had recorded it all. Every guest who had stayed, every hour of the night, every mundane action and private moment. It was obsessive, meticulous, almost loving in its detail, but also deeply unsettling. I found notebooks stacked like bricks, pages filled with notes about each visitor. Names, arrival times, peculiar behaviors, even what they had eaten for breakfast. In some cases, my uncle had written about the way guests interacted with the rooms, the way they touched the furniture, adjusted the curtains, or looked out the window at the passing highway. Every detail mattered. Every small gesture had been observed, cataloged, and for decades. I pulled a chair closer and sat, my mind trying to reconcile what I was seeing. My uncle, the quiet, solitary man who had died alone, had been here day after day, night after night, recording strangers. Perhaps he had justified it as care for the property or as a hobby, but the sheer scale of it was unnatural. The walls, once ordinary, became complicit witnesses, absorbing every movement, every sound. One tape caught my attention. The label read, March 1983, Room 217, overnight. I placed it on the recorder and the reel spun quietly. The image flickered, showing the room exactly as I imagined it. Dim light, a single bed, the dresser in the corner. Then the guest appeared, a man in his 40s, alone, moving through the room as if unaware of being watched. My stomach twisted as I realized the camera angle was impossible to spot. My uncle had hidden them with precision, built into the walls themselves. I watched, holding my breath, as the man moved about the room, oblivious to the lens. He read a book, poured a drink, adjusted the thermostat. Then he paused, eyes fixed on something in the air. He wasn't aware of the camera, but I could feel, watching him now, the same tension that my uncle must have felt while recording. The hotel had always observed its guests, and my uncle had ensured nothing went unnoticed. I set down the tape and reached for another. June 1991, Room 210, couple on vacation. The scene played out with ordinary motions, laughter, whispers, the clink of glasses, but there was something else, something in the shadows at the edge of the frame. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but the more I watched, the more I realized. There was a presence, subtle, almost imperceptible, hovering near the bed, watching the couple as intently as my uncle had. The hair on my arms rose. I tried to tell myself it was dust, or reflection, or a flaw in the camera, but it was deliberate. I flipped through the notebooks. Some entries described what my uncle called anomalies, moments when guests seemed to feel the hotel's awareness, shivers down the spine, hesitation at a closed door, the sensation of not being alone. He wrote about patterns in behavior, moments of unease, small missteps, things the average person would dismiss. But he noticed. He cataloged. He understood, or at least tried to understand, the life the building had absorbed. I leaned back in the chair, overwhelmed. The Marlowe was no longer just a hotel. It was a repository of observation, memory, and something older, something alive. The walls, the floors, the furniture, they remembered. They had witnessed decades of lives, of small actions, of whispered conversations. And my uncle had given them form, recorded every nuance, ensuring that nothing would ever be lost. It was then I realized what he had left for me. Not just the hotel, not just the keys, not just the deeds and unpaid bills, but a history of observation, of attention, of life lived in small, intimate details. It was beautiful and horrifying all at once. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, a living memory that stretched back through decades, connecting me to guests I had never met and moments I would never forget. The basement office became my sanctuary and my prison. Each tape, each notebook demanded time, demanded attention. I spent hours watching, listening, reading, cataloging. I noticed patterns. Certain guests checked into the hotel with the same ritual, certain rooms seemed to absorb tension, laughter, tears. The building itself had preferences, and my uncle had understood them. At night I slept upstairs, but I was never truly alone. I could hear the faint hum of the recording devices, a gentle pulse through the walls. Sometimes the shadows in the hall seemed to stretch longer, linger longer, and I felt the subtle brush of presence as I walked. I wasn't just observing the hotel anymore, it was observing me. My uncle had prepared it for that in his meticulous way, leaving me both caretaker and subject. I found entries about myself in the notebooks, though I had never known he was recording me. Trips to visit him as a child, phone calls left on the answering machine, conversations caught when I had no idea anyone was listening. A sense of intimacy and a creeping unease. I was part of the story now, woven into the hotel's memory, inseparable from its walls. There was one particular reel I could not bring myself to play. The label read only, "Do not watch." The handwriting was my uncle's, trembling, hesitant. I left it for another day, though a small part of me wanted desperately to see it, to know what he had recorded that was so urgent, so important. But there was fear, a quiet warning beneath curiosity. I could feel it in the room, in the still air, as if the building itself whispered, "Be careful. You belong here, but not all truths are yours yet." I realized then that the Marlowe was more than inheritance. It was initiation. Each night, as I descended to the basement office, as I reviewed the tapes and the notebooks, as I cataloged the movements and behaviors of strangers long gone, I felt myself being absorbed into its memory, into its rhythm. I could sense the weight of decades pressing down, guiding me, observing me, teaching me. And so I stayed. I watched, I listened, I cataloged. I recorded my own observations slowly, meticulously, adding my voice, my notes, my attention to the archive my uncle had built. The hotel had always required more than mere maintenance. It required devotion. It demanded acknowledgement. It was patient, persistent, and impossibly aware. Sometimes, when I closed the basement door, I could feel the hum of the monitors through the floorboards above. A subtle vibration, like the heartbeat of the building itself. I would pause, listening, feeling, aware that somewhere in the walls, the hotel remembered every sound, every breath, every step I had ever taken. I had come to document the hotel, but I realized now that it had documented me. Every thought, every movement, every hesitant step down a shadowed hallway. And the more I tried to leave, the more I understood. The hotel did not let go of those who observed it, not truly. It waited, it remembered, it recorded. And I, whether I liked it or not, had become part of its collection. The basement office, once hidden, became the center of my existence. Every day I descended the stairs, lights flickering softly, air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. I faced the tapes, the notebooks, the quiet weight of decades of observation. I felt the hotel breathe around me, alive in ways I had never anticipated. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The Marlowe was patient. I would learn everything it had to teach. And I would watch. Even after Uncle Howard's funeral, I kept returning to the basement office. The deed was mine now, and the Marlowe's pulse seemed to thrum louder in the silence of those empty halls. I thought that with him gone, the recordings would have ended, that the decades of surveillance had closed with his death. But the tapes told a different story. I remember the first night I noticed it. The housekeeper's lamp flickered at the top of the stairs, though there was no one there. The monitors in the basement hummed as usual, screens showing empty rooms, dust motes drifting in sunlight, shadows stretching across peeling wallpaper. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, like someone talking just out of sight. I froze, listening. It was a sound that had no source. No body to make it. A voice threading through the static, almost intelligible, saying something urgent but indistinct. I thought at first that I'd imagined it. The basement was full of old electronics, wires tangled like a spider's nest. Surely it was interference. But the more nights I spent down there, the clearer it became. The voices were coming from rooms long vacated, rooms that had been empty for years, some for decades. Room 210, the honeymoon suite from 1991, the very room where my uncle had recorded that faint shadow at the edge of the bed. And yet the voices continued, low, patient, insistent. I began to trace them, moving from monitor to monitor, rewinding, pausing, listening. Each room had its own cadence, its own whisper, as if the walls had decided to speak on their own. Sometimes I thought I heard laughter, soft and fleeting, a sound that belonged to someone remembering happiness they had never shared with anyone else. Other times it was fear, clipped and urgent, a staccato of panic carried through time. I found a tape labeled simply, "After March 12, 2019. That was the day my uncle had died. I pressed play. The image was grainy, shaky, but the sound, it was alive. I could hear a floorboard creak, a chair scrape, the subtle exhale of someone breathing, but the room was empty, absolutely empty. And yet there was presence, something patient, something that had settled into the corners of the frame, just beyond the reach of the camera lens. It was then I realized that the Marlowe was no longer my uncle. He had given it life, yes, but it had grown beyond him, beyond my understanding. The hotel remembered. It remembered all the guests, all the nights, every whisper and sigh. And now it was speaking for itself. I began taking notes, cataloging what I heard. It became an obsession. The voices did not always speak in words. Sometimes it was the rattle of a doorknob, a step on a creaking floor, a soft sigh carried down the hall. And then occasionally a single word like stay or wait or home. I could feel the presence more than hear it, a weight pressing through the walls, soft and patient, demanding attention. At first I tried to rationalize it. Ghosts, I told myself. Electrical interference. My imagination, haunted by years of watching, recording, cataloging. But rationality faltered when I caught movement on the monitors. Not shadows, not dust, not trick of the light, but movement that belonged to no living body. Chairs shifted, curtains swayed, towels folded themselves on beds that had been empty for over a decade. I started noticing patterns. The presence was patient, deliberate, following the schedule my uncle had once maintained. At 2:14 a.m., a light in room 214 flickered, a subtle movement as if someone entered and left. Towels folded themselves on the 2008 homicide suite precisely as they had decades ago. And the whispering, it came at the same time each night, threads of sound rising from empty rooms, persistent and expectant. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in my bedroom upstairs, listening to the faint creak of the building, my mind awake and alert. Every hallway, every door, every silent room seemed to contain life that was not visible. Sometimes I could almost feel it brushing against my shoulder as I moved through the halls. A resident who had never checked out, who had never left. I tried to leave once, packed my things, car running, keys in hand. But the hallway seemed to stretch differently that night. The exit appeared farther away than I remembered. A shadow detached itself from a corner, fleeting but unmistakable. I could feel it observing me, waiting. And I realized then that the hotel did not release its residents, not its permanent ones. It had claimed me in a way my uncle never had, not fully. I returned to the basement, drawn to the monitors, drawn to the whispers. I watched, cataloged, recorded. I tried to communicate with it, speaking softly into empty rooms, asking questions, leaving my voice on the recorders. Occasionally the building answered, a faint echo, a sigh, a tap. Always at the edges of perception, never fully present. It was impossible not to notice the walls watching me back. The furniture held attention, the floors remembered my footsteps, the wallpaper absorbed my shadow. And in some inexplicable way, I understood that the hotel had learned from my uncle, from the countless guests it had observed. That attention begets attention, that observation is reciprocity. I was not just observing, I was being observed. Carefully, deliberately, permanently. I found myself drawn to the older rooms, the ones that had been unoccupied for decades. Room 210, 214, 217, each seemed alive with memory. Sometimes I would lie on the bed, closed eyes, listening. The whispering would rise, soft and patient, threading through the emptiness, like a lullaby of memories that were never mine, yet now belonged to me. I began leaving traces of myself. A notebook here, a pen there, a chair adjusted slightly, small, deliberate movements that the hotel seemed to acknowledge. The towels would fold differently, a light would flicker, a chair would creak. It was learning from me just as I had been learning from it. There were nights when the whispering escalated, voices overlapping, rising into a chorus of memories and presents. I could hear my uncle's voice sometimes, faint, urging caution, whispering guidance, reminding me of my role, observer, participant, caretaker. But I knew now that I was no longer alone in that role. The hotel had its own agent, a permanent resident beyond life or death, beyond the records, moving silently through the empty rooms, guiding me, testing me, ensuring I remained attentive, present, compliant. I began to speak to it, to address it directly, softly, cautiously. My words were absorbed, acknowledged in subtle movements, in shadows that shifted just beyond my line of sight. Sometimes, when the lights flickered, I felt a hand brush past my own, though no one was there. And always the whispering, always the patient, deliberate voice of someone or something that had decided it would not leave, that it would remain permanent, enduring, observing. Sleep became secondary to the recordings, the monitors, the whispers. Each night I descended into the basement office, the Marlowe alive around me, full of history and presence. I watched the empty rooms fill themselves with echoes, with shadows, with whispers that belonged to no one I had ever known, and yet were mine to tend. I understood then that the hotel was not merely a building. It was a collection, a witness, a living memory. It had learned to speak, to move, to maintain itself without my uncle's guidance. And in a way, I was a participant in its preservation, its continuation. I was both observer and observed, caretaker and resident, permanent in a sense I could not yet fully articulate. And so I stayed, night after night, listening to the whispers from rooms that had been empty for years, aware that the Marlowe did not forget. That presence, patient and deliberate, had made itself known, and I realized I could never leave. I was part of the memory now. I had become a permanent resident. The whispers were patient, waiting, learning, guiding, and I listened.